Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Order. Before commencing this afternoon's useful, important debate and called by the Petitions Committee of the House of Commons, I thought it might be useful if I laid out a couple of rules of procedure for the afternoon. First of all, quite a large number of members have signified their intention of speaking. However, we have a 3-hour debate, and I don't intend to apply a formal time limit on speeches, at least to begin with. We have got the authority to do that later on. But I think if members are sensible and restrict their remarks to 5 or 10 minutes apiece, we might hope to get most members who wish to into the debate. Second, the motion before us today, namely that we have considered the petition, is a very specific motion indeed. And I do intend to be fairly strict in preventing members from rambling widely into every issue there is to do with the European Union and Brexit. That's not a matter for debate this afternoon. The debate is simply about whether or not we should have a second referendum on the matter. And with that as prologue, can I invite Mr. Ian Blackford to propose a motion?
Thank you, Mr. Gray. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 1312-15 relating to EU referendum rules. I appreciate the motivation for those who have called for a second referendum. It is a mark of irresponsible government that more than 2 months after the EU referendum, we know nothing more than the Prime Minister's soundbite that Brexit means Brexit. We're not the only ones confused by the UK government's haphazard approach to leaving the UK. Speaking at the G20 summit in China, President Obama said the UK will not be prioritised in free trade talks. Obama said that he had never meant to say that the US would punish Great Britain, but simply that he wanted to challenge the notion that the consequences of Brexit were negligible and that Brexiteers would just go ahead and light up a whole bunch of free trade agreements. An official Japanese government briefing leaked to the G20 summit in China warned of the repercussions for the thousands of people employed by Japanese car, finance and high-tech firms in the UK, and has sought assurances over continued access to the single market, tariff levies and other trade privileges. Mr. Chairman, the notion that the UK can quickly put in place trade deals around the world is fanciful. It is wishful thinking without any basis based on experience or likelihood of delivery. It is no more than a policy of hope for the best. The UK government should follow the example of the Scottish government, announce an urgent economic stimulus plan. We are clear the least bad option requires the UK to stay within the single market. The Scottish government will use its influence to shape the best outcome for Scotland and the UK as a whole. That means that the UK continuing as a member of the single market.
Having said that I was going to do this to begin with, I hope the Honourable Gentleman will forgive me if I immediately point out to him that we are in fact discussing the question of whether or not there should be a second referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. It is therefore not in order to discuss anything to do with Scotland. It's not in order to discuss anything to do with the role of Britain in the wider world. Our sole purpose this afternoon is to discuss whether or not there should be a second referendum on our membership of the European Union. Perhaps the Honourable Gentleman could restrain himself to that particular topic.
I'm grateful for the guidance from the Chair, and if he will forgive me, what I'm trying to do is actually move on to discuss the very topic he's doing, but I'm putting it into the context of many things that happened during the referendum campaign and why we're in the position that we're in. And that being said, I'm more than happy to give way.
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way, and mindful of the Chair's comments, I'll try and put my intervention in the correct context as well. Many of my constituents have written to me arguing for a second referendum, but what many of them have also argued is that it must be absolutely clear that there cannot be a situation where Parliament doesn't get to have a say in this issue again, and certainly not the case where devolved administrations and governments don't get to have a say. It's my view that they absolutely must. Would he agree?
Thank you. I'm very grateful for the intervention from the honourable member, and I will come on to talk about the issue of sovereignty of Parliament and indeed the sovereignty of people where that matters, because I think it's a very important point that he's made and one that I want to address as I move through my remarks.
Thank you very much for that. But given the difficulties that he's outlining, isn't actually the call for a second referendum not only damaging to our democracy, but also enormously diversionary from the tasks that he's outlined of negotiating our relationship with our European neighbours, negotiating our relationship with the rest of the world, and probably equally significantly, getting British government machinery working efficiently and effectively to make decisions in order that we can compete in that new world.
I understand the point that the honourable gentleman is making, but of course I think there is the issue of what people were voting for. Because if I can contrast the situation that we had in Scotland in 2014, when the Scottish Government had a 650-page white paper that laid out exactly what would happen to Scotland post-voting for independence. The problem with the Brexit campaign is that we didn't have a manifesto. We had a whole range of I'll happily give way, yes.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Yesterday, the Prime Minister confirmed that there is no commitment to give additional funds to the NHS as a consequence of Brexit, a pledge which toured the country on the side of a bus and on the basis of which millions of people voted in good faith to leave the EU. The Prime Minister says Brexit means Brexit, but when pledges like this are broken almost immediately, none of us really knows what Brexit will mean. Does he agree with me that this lack of clarity further underlines the case for the British people to be able to see the detail of the actual Brexit deal and vote again on whether they would like to proceed on those specific terms, and that this should take place before Article 50 is triggered?
In Blackford?
I think it is fair to say that those on the Brexit side failed to really put across exactly what Brexit meant. And we had the now Chancellor, the now Foreign Secretary, that on the week after the Brexit result said the government had no plan. And I think that's really the difficulty that the Honourable Lady is referring to. When the Prime Minister says Brexit means breakfast, what does it mean? There has not been an explanation as to exactly what it does mean.
Grateful to him for giving way. I think when we're talking about the second referendum, it is important to be clear about whether or not we're simply rerunning the old referendum, and I'm not sure that anyone is much suggesting that. That would be absolutely undermining of democracy. But whether or not there should be a referendum on the terms of any new deal, I think is absolutely crucial. And in that context, would he agree with me that we should take into account the conclusions of the Electoral Reform Society, which has done a report into the myths, misinformations and downright lies in the last referendum, and saying we've got to do things better next time?
In Blackford?
Agree with the Honourable Lady insofar as the Electoral Reform Society did talk about many of the good things that were contained in our referendum in Scotland in 2014, what was often described as a gold standard, the fact that we had a long referendum campaign and that people were able to make a judgment as they saw it based on the facts that they saw at the time. So I think there's a reasonable point as far as that's concerned. Let me try and make some progress, and I'll be happy to take more interventions. As I was outlining, the Scottish Government has already announced an additional £100 million of funding in this financial year to stimulate the economy, following the uncertainty about the UK's future relationship with the EU. As a Scottish MP, I fully support the action being taken by the Scottish Government, backed by a vote in the Scottish Parliament, empowering the Scottish Government to secure Scotland's place within the EU. Now, Mr Chairman, I think this is the context which is important to this debate, because when the vote was taken in the Scottish Parliament, 106 members voted for the motion, 8 against and 3 abstentions. Our Scottish Parliament, on a cross-party basis, has given an unequivocal statement: Scotland voted to remain in Europe. Let me put it this way to the House: remain means remain. Government in Westminster repeatedly tells us that they respect the authority of the Parliament in Edinburgh. The government in London should reflect on what respect means when it comes to Section 50, and a desire, if that is what they have, to remove the UK from Europe before recognising our desire and our right to remain in Europe. Our position must be given consignments. As the UK develops its position ahead of triggering Article 50, the Scottish Government must be given a central role in deliberations and negotiations. The Prime Minister must not bypass Scotland on the EU negotiations. It is, Mr Chairman, deeply worrying that the Prime Minister is ploughing ahead with a hard Brexit. We wish... Scottish breakfast, yeah. Other than the dog's breakfast that was a Brexit campaign, we wish to remain in Europe with full access to the single market and with full free movement of people.
I'm very sorry to interrupt the honourable gentleman again, but I did make it absolutely plain at the beginning of the debate. This debate is on the very, very, very narrow and specific question of the wording of the referendum, the wording of the petition. Namely, we, the undersigned, call on HM government to implement a rule that if the Remain or Leave vote is less than 60% based on turnout, less than 75%, there should be another referendum. That is the topic of debate. We're not debating whether or not we should be in the European Union. We're not debating what happened in the Scottish Parliament. We're not debating the benefits of Brexit or the benefits of staying in the European Union. We are simply debating whether or not there should be a repeat of the original EU referendum. And I think the Honourable Gentleman should probably return to that subject if you wouldn't mind.
I'm grateful for the guidance from the Chair, and I'm seeking to try and do that, but I'm building up an argument about why we're in the position that we're in, and if you will give some forbearance to me, I will address myself to those remarks. Well, but the point, however, because we're being asked whether or not the rules of the EU referendum, what I'm specifically arguing, and it does come down to this issue of where sovereignty lies, in our opinion, sovereignty in Scotland lies with the people. And the people of Scotland voted 62% to remain within Europe. And these are the arguments that I'm going to be outlining in this debate. I believe under the process of freedom of speech I should be entitled to do so. I note that the respected Professors Chalmers and Menyon, writing for Open Europe, have suggested that Scotland could have a different relationship with the EU than the rest of the UK, including free movement of people, and Scotland continued to sign up to EU law. Others have pointed to the so-called reverse Greenland scenario, where the rest of the UK leaves the EU, but Scotland retains the existing rights and a membership of the EU. It is up to Westminster whether it is willing to recognise Scotland's position requiring its own settlement, perhaps along with Northern Ireland, another of the family of nations who voted to remain. Mr Chairman, as I've said, 62% of Scots who voted expressed a desire to remain. We often hear of the sovereignty of Parliament. Let me say that we have our own tradition in Scotland, and that is one where the people are sovereign. In the case of McCormick versus the Lord Advocate in the Court of Session in 1953...
Order. I really must now insist that the Honourable Gentleman returns to the topic of the debate in hand, namely, should we have a second referendum on the European on the EU? If he's unable to return to that subject, he'll have to resume his seat and move to other speakers in the chamber that will do so. It's nothing to do with freedom of speech. But the topic of the debate is absolutely plain, and it's vitally important that he should address himself to that topic and to nothing else. The Honourable Gentleman.
With respect, Mr Chairman, that is precisely what I'm trying to do. I'm putting it in the context of what has happened in Scotland, and on the basis of free speech, I ask that I be given the opportunity to present this way as the way that I feel is appropriate to the people of my country. This is about the people of Scotland being listened to, where the people of Scotland, under the rules of the referendum, have voted to remain, and I'm perfectly entitled to make that argument, which is what I intend to do. The principle of unlimited sovereignty of Parliament is a distinctly English principle which has no counterpart in Scottish constitutional law. Mr Chairman, this judgment recognises the sovereignty of the people of Scotland, and it is something that the government in London is going to have to accept. Scotland voted to remain, we remain citizens of Europe, and this must be respected. Those who have signed this petition and pushed for a second referendum, I would hope would recognise that as a Scottish MP seeking to hold the government in London to account, and standing up for the people of Scotland that voted to remain, that my primary responsibility is to the people of Scotland. I will happily give way.
Well, on the sovereignty of the people of Scotland, did they not vote to remain in the United Kingdom? And as such, was it not implicit that they accepted the constitutional arrangements of the United Kingdom?
We had a referendum in 2014, and of course 45% of those that voted in that referendum voted for independence, 55% voted to remain in the UK. I will in a second. But the important point, in that referendum debate, both the Conservative Liberal coalition government and their partners in Better Together, the Labour Party, told the people of Scotland that if you voted to remain within the UK, that your position within Europe would be guaranteed. What happened was that the people of Scotland were misled in that referendum. And I will return to the mandate which has been given to the Scottish Government by the Scottish Parliament on a cross-party basis, which is to seek to protect Scotland's position within the EU. And all measures, up to including a second independence referendum, will be necessary to protect our position. And I happily give way to the honourable member.
I understand the position. He's, in the last 2 years, taken part in 2 referendums. He's happened to lose both of them. And now, as a consequence of that, he wants to rerun both, I imagine. So which is going to come first? Is it going to be the EU referendum or the Scottish independence referendum that he wants to rerun?
In Blackburn.
To the terms of the debate today, but what I am arguing very strongly, that my primary interest in this case is to protect Scotland's position within the EU, and I hope give some succour in that case to those that have argued for this petition today. That's the first priority that we have. Now, if the only way that we can protect Scotland's position because the UK government refuses to recognise our position as independence, then of course we'll be saying to the Scottish people that that's the path that they should be going down. I will happily give way.
So just for clarity, the member is confirming that he wants to have a free, independent Scotland ruled from Brussels.
I have to say to my honourable friend who I have a lot of time for, it's about securing Scotland's position within Europe. It's making sure that Scotland is a destination, that we can fulfil our potential, that we can deliver sustainable economic growth for Scotland. And in order to do that, we need the benefits of free movement.
Order! I've told the honourable gentleman on several occasions now, this debate is not about any of the things about which he's currently discussing. He is completely and utterly out of order. He's discussing a debate which is not for this chamber today. Now, if the honourable gentleman persists in doing that, I will ask him to resume his seat, and I'll pass the floor to somebody else. I do insist the honourable gentleman should return to the debate, the motion in front of us today, namely that whether or not there should be a second referendum on our membership of the European Union. That is the topic of the debate, nothing else. If he can't do that, he will have to remain seated. I invite him now to return to his feet and to discuss the issue of whether or not there should be a second referendum.
I have to say, I'm quite surprised by those remarks, because all that I was doing was responding to an intervention which I was answering to the fullest extent that I could. Now, if I can try and then move on. It is perhaps pertinent to ask how the UK has got itself into this situation. At the last election, the then leader of the Conservative Party committed his party to a referendum on EU membership if he was elected to government. This was not from a position of conviction that he personally wanted out of the EU, but simply to buy those off in his own party who did not want to be part of Europe. There was no leadership. There was no vision as to how to take Europe forward. It was an abrogation of responsibility. What then happened was that we had the most unedifying of campaigns. In Scotland, we often refer to the arrangements for our own referendum being the gold standard, although admittedly it did not stop the descent into negativity that characterised Project Fear. We could argue that there was a strong public engagement and, crucially, young people whose future would be determined by the vote, those aged 16 and 17, were able to participate. EU citizens living in Scotland also participated, and rightly so. The EU referendum was different. 16 and 17-year-olds excluded. EU citizens excluded. We might have anticipated then that it was likely to become a narrow and inward-looking debate. That, Mr. Chairman, is precisely what happened. The Prime Minister and his government, who wanted to remain in Europe, had the opportunity to shape that debate. Rather than paint a vision of UK and Europe, Project Fear went into overdrive. Not so much a positive case for Europe, but a campaign that failed to inspire. A Prime Minister going into battle with a plan that was flawed, something that became increasingly obvious in the months leading up to the referendum. In much of the UK, it became a debate about immigration, not so much about how migration both in and out of the UK can enrich our society and the rest of the world, but a fear of immigration. Little appreciation and understanding as to the positive impact migrants have on our economy, the contribution that migrants have made to our health service and our other public services. There has been much talk of those left behind, those that do not see an improvement in their living standards and their quality of life. It is not immigration that has led to such circumstances. It has been a failure of government policy to invest in our public services to make sure there is sufficient capacity to meet the needs of all our communities. We need to create this. I will happily give way.
Thank your member for giving way. I agree with him that the referendum campaign was flawed in terms of the information that people had access to. But I also agree with the honourable member for Brighton Pavilion that we shouldn't be looking to rerun the referendum we've just had. We should instead be looking forward to having a referendum on the Brexit deal, because the big question facing us now is, what does Brexit actually mean? I'm not sure what the honourable gentleman's stance is on this. Is he talking about a rerun of the campaign, the vote that we had on 23rd of June, or is he talking about a Brexit vote?
No, I'm not talking about a rerun of the referendum campaign that would have had. What I am arguing, that specifically as a Scottish MP, that Scotland voted to remain, and before we go through the process of Section 50, that government in Westminster has that opportunity to reflect on recognising the sovereignty of the people of Scotland, and I think through doing so, then that perhaps help those that have moved this motion today. This is the debate that we should have been having rather than the one that we had. Rather than investing in our future, immigrants have become scapegoated. Hate crime has been on the rise. Not only have immigrants been scapegoated, but EU citizens living here are now fearful on whether they will have long-term rights to remain. On the morning of the 24th of June, while there was a failure of leadership from the UK government, it was the First Minister of Scotland who spoke for many, and a measure that would not just resonate in Scotland, but many throughout the UK, when she put across a very clear message. EU citizens living here are our friends, our neighbours, our colleagues, and they are welcome. In Scotland, we have 173,000 EU citizens who are part of all our communities. Many are fearful as whether they can remain. This uncertainty still exists today. The Prime Minister should do the right thing and state that all those that are here now are welcome to stay. It is about doing the right thing. Those that are here today have been welcomed in. Why would we not remove any uncertainty? We are talking about people who under no circumstances should be used as bargaining counters in any Brexit talks. Where is the humanity? Prime Minister, you will be judged by your actions. Show compassion, show decency. We should also have been discussing the very pillars of the arguments of the benefit of European membership, of peace within the continent, fostered by nations working together for the common good.
Returning to the motion, would the honourable member agree that it is not really the way we do things in this whole United Kingdom to change the rules of the game ex post facto if we don't like the result, which is precisely what this motion proposes, and that even amongst people who voted to remain, myself included, a very large number would not accept having a second referendum because they are disappointed by the result?
In Blackford.
I have some sympathy with the honourable member. I think there are flaws in the way that the referendum was conducted. But as a Democrat and someone that argues very much in the sovereignty of people, then I would have to say that I have some sympathy with that view. You can't override democracy by denying the right of those that voted in the referendum in the UK. But equally, I would say to the House that we also have to recognise the votes of the people in Scotland that voted to remain. We need to champion the benefits of the single market in trade and in services and yes, in people. Much of this positive argument was lost in the deluge of fear and negativity. The costs of our membership were much discussed, but not the benefits. When it came down to costs, those that spoke about a bounty for the NHS should hang their heads in shame. Much of the Brexiteers' argument has been shown to be false. Those responsible for those situations are those who engineered the referendum and our departed Prime Minister, who showed a complete lack of leadership in securing the UK's continued membership of the EU. It is often claimed that all political careers end in failure. The Prime Minister fell on his own sword after the referendum result. His tenure will be reflected on as one where he presided over the UK leaving the EU, something he was personally against. I cannot think of a greater foreign policy disaster for any Conservative Prime Minister since Eden and the Suez Crisis. Not only did the Prime Minister announce he was going, we then had one of the prime architects for vote leave, the ex-mayor of London, proclaim the government did not have a plan for Brexit.
Order. The honourable gentleman has been asked on repeated occasions to return his remarks simply to the very simple issue of whether or not we should repeat the referendum. I do now require him, if he wants to continue, to return to that specific topic and no other topic at all. If he can't do that, then perhaps he'll have to resume his seat and I'll pass the floor to somebody else. Mr. Ian Blackford to talk specifically about the second referendum.
When I am trying to address myself to that topic, and if the chair bears with me, I'm just a short few remarks from closing.
Order. Nor will the honourable gentleman enter into discussion with the chair as to what it is that I'm ruling. My rule is final, and whatever I say goes in this chamber. And what I'm saying is the honourable gentleman is deviating wildly from the topic we're discussing. I'm requiring the honourable gentleman to return to the specific topic we're discussing. If he cannot do so, I'll ask him to resume his seat. Mr. Ian Blackford.
I do hope that the people of Scotland are listening to this debate and the conduct of it. When I contrast the omni-shambles of the EU referendum with our own referendum in Scotland, those of us arguing for independence had the benefit of a 650-page white paper that went through every area of government. The Brexiteers wanted out of Europe, but they had no plan for the day after or any other day in the future. We were all to be cast adrift from Europe when the government does decide to enact Article 50 and begin the process of disengagement. Disengagement from Europe, but still no plan to put in place much heralded new trade agreements. Not only a lack of leadership from the government, but also from the Labour opposition, whose campaign to remain in the UK was lukewarm at best. Labour sources have repeatedly suggested their leader may not even have voted to remain. It is little wonder that we are where we are today. A UK that has turned its back on the EU. We know who the real separatists are in the UK. We live in uncertain times. Western economies are still grappling with the fallout from the financial crisis in 2007 and 8. Brexit has led to the Bank of England...
The Honourable Gentleman, I'm most grateful to him for his remarks. He will now resume his seat. Mr. John Penrose. On a point of order, I understand you make a point of order. On a point of order, Mr. John Penrose.
I am making a speech which is legitimate in the context of this debate, and the people in Scotland will see exactly what is happening here, which is the chair of this committee refusing the elected representatives of the people of Scotland to give a speech. That is the clear judgment of what has been delivered by this chair.
Order. As a Scot, I very much hope the Scots are indeed listening to this debate. The Honourable Gentleman is entirely out of order. Mr. John Penrose.
Mr. Gray, as Minister for Constitutional Reform at the time, I had responsibility for the detailed election rules set out in the EU Referendum Act. And since those rules would have included whether to have a supermajority of the kind which is proposed and suggested by this petition, I thought it might help if I explained why we didn't include it in the Act at the time and why it wasn't part of the rules which were passed by this Parliament last year. In the event, there wasn't much discussion of supermajorities as Parliament debated the Act. But if it had come up, Mr. Chairman, I suspect there would have been widespread opposition to it in advance from campaigners on both sides of the debate. Because no matter what the issue at hand may be, a supermajority gives an inbuilt advantage to the status quo. It tilts the playing field deliberately in favour of no change. In other words, it would rightly have been seen as a pretty transparent attempt to give the Remain campaign an enormous, and in the eyes of many unfair, advantage. Supporters of Leave would have denounced it in ringing terms, and equally importantly, more thoughtful Remain campaigners would probably have felt uncomfortable too. Because the referendum...
The Honourable Member made a very interesting start to his speech. Would you agree with me then that for anyone to deliver literature in the closing days of any referendum campaign, strongly advising people, if in doubt, vote no, vote for status quo, would you agree that that is an irresponsible way to do it? If both sides of the campaign are supposed to be balanced, if people are in doubt, they should not vote.
Rose?
My point was that in setting up a supermajority, as this petition suggests, we would have tilted the rules unfairly in favour of Remain. In having a fair and level playing field, then both sides are free to make their case as strongly as they can and to rebut the other side's case if they feel it is wrong. He clearly felt that some of the points made were entirely incorrect. But at that point, the correct response is to argue against it, to engage in democratic debate at the time, not to try and tilt the playing field towards one side or the other. Happily.
He's making a very interesting point about supermajorities, but it is the fact that in British constitutional history they were used in the devolution referendums in the end of the 1970s, and indeed are used in many other democracies, in the United States, for example, with amendments to the Constitution. And herein lies the problem. Does he agree with me that one of the clashes that we've got here, while we're having this very debate today, is that it is a narrow result? Many of us wish to respect that, but at the same time, my own constituency voted 60-40 to Remain. We have the situation regarding Scotland, and that is why the public feel very, very torn both ways, and that's just the difficulty that we're all dealing with here.
John Penrose?
I completely agree with the Honourable Gentleman. The outcome, while still definitive, there was well more than 1 million votes in the overall majority, was still uncomfortably narrow, and there are 48% of the population who were on one side. And therefore, there is a healing process. Democratically, we need to go through that as a society, as an entire country, in order to repair that damage. But wishing that it were otherwise will not change a historical fact, which is what the result was, and the fact that the rules were as fair as this Parliament could make them after extensive debate at the time. Because, Mr. Gray, the referendum with these rules was intended to put the question of our EU membership to rest once and for all. If it was an unfair election where the rules were slanted in one direction or the other, it would have completely failed in that central aim. Far from drawing a line under the issue forever, we would have faced a never-ending, both sides banging on about Europe for decades and decades in future. I doubt anyone could invent something more divisive, distracting, and frankly soul-destroyingly boring if they tried. I'd happily, what a choice.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Does he think that the outcome of this referendum ensures that they won't be banging on about Europe for the next 5-10 years?
John Penrose.
Mr. Gray, I will merely respond by saying that I hope that the period of banging on about Europe will be much shorter now than it would be if we had more referendums about it in future. I think the Honourable Gentleman, there are two minds with but I think a single thought, clearly. So the danger of a supermajority is that it will be seen as a coded attempt by disappointed pro-Europeans to rerun the original referendum because they didn't like the result. Mr. Chairman, I supported the Remain campaign myself, but even I think that a rerun would be a huge mistake. Because whichever side we were on at the time, I hope that we are all of us here, Democrats, first, last, and always.
I thank my friend for giving way, because I campaigned on the Remain side, and I must say was disappointed with negativity on both sides, including our own. But general election campaigns have negative arguments in them, and I don't think anyone would think that we should challenge a general election result because one side used negative arguments.
Mr. Gray, I completely agree. I mean, every time either the Lib Dems or the Labour Party win a local council by-election, I'm convinced that everyone has taken leave of their senses. But as a Democrat, I respect the result and I accept it, and I'm sure everybody here would do the same, no matter which side of a particular debate they are on. So, once more, and then I must...
Yes, and I wonder whether he would like to speculate, perhaps not for this debate, but for another, in response to the emails that we have all had from people who have called for an independent body to assess the claims that are made during the course of a referendum. Is that something that he would support?
Penrose.
Mr. Chairman, I worry about such proposals, if only because I think it would potentially create a vehicle for vexatious claims being made during a campaign as a way of trying to smear the opposition, whether they were making legitimate or illegitimate comments at all. The whole point about democratic campaigning in any elections, we all well know here, is that if somebody says something which you regard to be wrong, which you regard to be an egregious slur on you or on your party or on reality, doesn't matter, the answer is not to run to the lawyers. The answer is to get out there and explain to the voters why what has been said is entirely wrong and get on with it that way. So, Mr. Gray, the country has voted to leave the EU. Whether individually we in this room agree with it or not, the decision has been made. If we now decide that we won't leave after all, and will hold another referendum instead, the outrage at an out-of-touch political class, deaf to the desires of the people who elected them, will be absolutely shattering.
Will my honourable friend give way on this point? I mean, this is precisely the assumption that I think many Remainers have, or certainly at the beginning, was that they would somehow win the second referendum. All the evidence I see, and certainly in my constituency, suggests that there would be a resounding defeat, actually, for the Remainers, if indeed we were to go down that route.
Well, Mr. Gray, at a time when, with isolated exceptions, notable exceptions, both in the Scottish independence referendum, but also in other votes around the country as well, at a time when we are suffering as a democracy from declining turnout, from decline of voter registration, I think that we all need to ask ourselves why part of the backing for the Leave campaign was this cry of frustration at our democracy. And I can think of nothing more dangerous, nothing more corrosive, if we in this place say that we are not listening and we stick our fingers in our ears and refuse to honour the decisive decision, the decisive verdict which has been rendered unto us, whatever side we started off the referendum campaign on. So, if we were to do that, very briefly, then I must finish my remarks. I want to make...
The remarks that he's making about the dreadful finality of this result, could they not equally have been made then about the referendum that was held in 1975 to go into the European community?
Penrose.
I'm not quite sure what the honourable gentleman's point is. I think what I'm arguing is that if we have a clear democratic decision, then regardless of what the lawyers may say, democratically, we owe it to the people who sent us here to listen to what they have said. It's a very simple point, and I just worry that some people who are disappointed, understandably, I was on the same side, are trying to find reasons to comfort themselves to ignore this, and I don't think that we can. Voters will, if we try to ignore it, rightly ask what part of the word leave is so hard for you all to understand. We've been given our marching orders, ladies and gentlemen. Brexit must mean Brexit, and it's up to every red-blooded Democrat, no matter which side they were on before the result was known, to accept the clear electoral verdict and to pull together to deliver it as best we can.
Hear, hear, hear. David Lammy.
We're very grateful, Mr. Gray. Look, we're here today, and there are a number of members and right honourable members of this House who've long believed, as we've heard, that, or not as we've heard, but I know there are members who believe this, that Britain's interests would be best served outside the European Union. And members campaign passionately for Brexit and ardently believe that the result delivered on the 23rd of June means that Brexit should be delivered immediately. No ifs, no buts, and frankly, no questions asked. But it would be churlish not to congratulate them on the referendum result and acknowledge, as has been said, that 52% of the country, or thereabouts, voted to exit the European Union. But I think, Mr. Gray, and I was listening to the member for Holter Price and Howden speaking on the floor of the House just before this debate about what Brexit means. And what he said was, Brexit means that we will exit the European Union. Well, I think we've all got to concede, and I really hope this chamber concedes, that 2.5 months down the line, we don't know what Brexit actually means in reality, and we're living in uncertain terms, and that's why we have this petition on the floor today. We don't know what form Brexit will take, or when it might happen. We don't know whether our future lies within the single market or outside of it. When we talk about access to the single market after Brexit, what do we mean by that? Of course we will have access. North Korea has access. That's not what we're talking about. The question's on what terms will the UK obtain that access, and at what cost will it obtain that access? We also don't know what our trading relationships with the rest of the world will look like, and millions of European Union citizens who've made this country their home are living now in uncertainty and don't know what their status is. And many of the 4 million people who signed this petition are understandably very anxious about their future, and that is why we're in this chamber, and why it is legitimate. And there are many arguments. You could, and there are many who believe this, and I'll come back to this, believe that there should be a vote on this House on Brexit when we are much clearer about what the government plans. There are some who believe that the best way forward is in a general election where political parties can put their position to the electorate. And there are others who quite rightly say, no, we need a second referendum on a plan when we see it. So I think that's the nature of the debate we're having, even though there might be some who muddy the waters. I will give way, but I'm very conscious that there are many others who must get in to this debate. But I'll give way.
I appreciate his generosity with his time. With regard to that second referendum on specifics of a renegotiated position, would he suggest that if the outcome of that referendum was a rejection of the current status quo, that the British people should then be presented with a different negotiated position for Brexit, or the removal of Brexit, or a second referendum? What would be the proposed question in that referendum on the negotiated position?
David Lammy.
The honourable member doesn't seem to see this as I do. I believe that in this country we are already amidst a constitutional crisis. It is why there is a case currently going on in the High Court, both in this country and in Northern Ireland, in relation to this topic. So all I have outlined is that there are some who legitimately believe, because we're amidst that constitution, that one way out of it is at least to put a plan to the people. The determinants of that plan are not a matter for today, but the principle is one that requires debate. And it is concerning that given the decision we have made that affects generations of young people in this country, there are so many people who believe in sovereignty that seem to want to limit debate and discussion in this House. And the hours we've spent on Europe since the 23rd of June, frankly, are minimal, given the seriousness of the decision that we are now about to take. So a lot of people on both sides of the referendum debate would accept that the public were totally misled and lied to during the referendum. Nobody would accept that there's a clear plan for where we go from here and what we do next. So there is a legitimate argument that whatever the plan is forthcoming for Brexit will look like, it should be put to the people in a referendum. It should be debated and voted for in Parliament, or a general election should be held on the issue. All three of these options have been ruled out by the government, by the way, all three of them, and yet there's still a vacuum. There's a division, there's uncertainty, and that's why this particular mechanism is being discussed today. And we all know, of course I give way to my...
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, for giving way. I didn't hear what you said, Mr. Gray.
You said my name.
Oh yes, I am me. But there are just two additional points I wanted to add and ask whether my right honourable friend agreed. One is that whatever your view as to whether there should be a vote in this House on the triggering of Article 50, there at least should be a debate. And secondly, in respect of this issue of votes and whether you have a vote on Article 50 or not, in some senses that's rather academic, because we are going to have to repeal the 1972 European Communities Act to give effect to us leaving the European Union. And that in and of itself is going to involve multiple votes, which will have knock-on impacts on existing legislation that's going to need to be changed.
Well, my honourable friend is right. It is absolutely the case, and that's why it was breathtaking to hear that Britain will not be discussing Europe for much longer. This House, if we exit the European Union, is about to be consumed with legislation that will probably be with us for more than a decade. I think there's one department in Whitehall alone, DEFRA, where there are 1,200 pieces of legislation that would require repealing. The task ahead for this nation is gargantuan. And frankly, we're talking about the sort of effort perhaps involved after the war with Reconstruction, or comparable perhaps to either the birth of empire or the loss of empire. But it's that scale, and I'm not going to give way because I think I should make it, it's that scale of challenge that we're talking about that would come back to Parliament. And I think that's also something that the British people, quite rightly, because the truth is, if we're doing that, we're not doing other things. But the other point, I think I've said that I should make some progress. Others have got to get in, and they make very important contributions. The other point is that we know that uncertainty is bad for business and bad for our economy. Just last week, a survey by Lloyds found that business confidence has dropped to its lowest level since December 2011. Uncertainty in government is also bad news. If the whole of Whitehall is focused on trying to work out Brexit and then trying to deliver Brexit, where is the capacity to tackle many, many other urgent issues facing our country? The crisis in the NHS, youth unemployment, infrastructure project, the rebalancing of our economy. Just last week, massive cuts announced to apprenticeships. We need working class young people in apprenticeship moving forward. How are we going to do those things when we're consumed in every single Whitehall department with the subject of Brexit? But the reason I'm here today, and the reason I'm very clear on this issue, is really on behalf of my constituents, because it's ordinary working people on low incomes who will suffer the most in the man-made recession to come. As always, people living paycheck to paycheck, just about keeping their heads above water, making ends meet in insecure jobs, will bear the brunt of any economic downturn. And when unemployment rises, tax receipts will fall, NHS spending will fall, wages will fall, investment will fall, and after years of austerity, the government won't have the money for a fiscal stimulus or to provide a proper welfare safety net. Many are talking about areas of the country that, agricultural areas of the country I know this is the case in a county like Norfolk that relied on EU subsidies. Some have been asking, are we still going to get the EU subsidies?
Firm with our colleague from the Scottish National Party. I think we should also be firm with the honourable gentleman. He has been very much in order so far, but he might like now to return to the subject of our debate.
Well, I'm very grateful, Mr. Gray, and you're absolutely right. I'm simply making the case that those EU subsidies will no longer be there. They will have gone, and tax receipts will have fallen, and it's for that reason that how we resolve the constitutional crisis that we're now in is so important. And of course, the mechanism of this petition is but one way of doing that. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about the gap between the rich and the poor and the growing divide in society between the asset class and the underclass. And indeed, why so many people voted for Brexit related to that point. But what I'm worried about, and why I'm here on behalf of my constituents, Mr. Gray, is because that debate in this country about inequality is very likely, with less funds, to turn to an old debate, which is about absolute poverty. And absolute poverty is much, much worse in any economy. And that's why I think it's important that we're having debates on the floor of the House in the way that we're doing, and frankly that we haven't been able to do since the 23rd of June. Now, I've already said that it's understandable that many British people, and certainly those who signed the petition, and there are more out there because they're emailing all the time, who have signed this petition, recognise, they're trying to do something on behalf of them as individuals, but they do of course recognise the debate that's also going on that is legitimate and linked to that democratic exercise, and that is a debate around sovereignty and the nature of Parliament, and whether Parliament should indeed have a vote on this issue. And it seems to me the most fundamental tenet of our democracy is parliamentary sovereignty, and a decision of this significance must be debated and approved by Parliament. And when the Prime Minister says she wants to bring the country back together, well, the best way to do that is to have its representative democracy debate the issues, look at the issues, and with that conclusion, we might begin to bring the country back together. But simply exercising a prerogative power, frankly, it's more akin to James II, I think is very unlikely to bring people back together. What it will do is leave a huge division running through this country that we've not seen for many years. It must be up to individual members of Parliament how they vote when the government's able to present a plan for what Brexit looks like. There must be a full and consideration of the plan. And I note, actually, it's very important, the words that when we looked at the last vote, that this does not have, or the referendum that we voted on, it was said that this does not have a constitutional provision which would require the results of a referendum to be implemented. Those were the words, not of a bitter Remainer campaigner, they were the words of the House of Commons Library briefing on the European Union referendum bill. It is important that we think hard about the fact that the referendum was described to this House when we voted on it as advisory and non-binding. It was advice to hear what the people have to say, but it was not binding. It was not 2/3. It was not a quadruple lock, all nations agreeing, so that we can move forward in a straightforward constitution. It was a non-binding advisory referendum, and as such, we need further to hear that advice and really think about the detail of how we now move forward. And what are honourable members scared of? Why are they so scared of a Parliament look? Is it because the government of the day is divided on this issue? Is that why they're scared about having that such debate? I suspect it is. So we must also remember that 63% of the electorate didn't vote for Brexit at all, that more than 2 million British expats were denied a vote, and 13 million more decided not even to cast their vote. There was no two-thirds threshold, I'm not giving way, there were no two-thirds threshold as is required in other nations to validate a major constitutional changes of this nature. There was no quadruple lock to ensure that majority in each of the constitutions, constituent nations of the United Kingdom agreed with the change. Our nation is more divided than ever in my lifetime, and we're living through an unprecedented period of uncertainty. There's no clarity on what lies ahead and no easy way to heal these divisions. Whilst colleagues may disagree with me when it comes to Brexit, I cannot see a way out of this other than for the government to present its plan for Brexit to Parliament so that members of Parliament can approve or reject it on behalf of their constituents, or present the plan to the people so that they can have their say either in a second vote or in a general election.
Order. Sir William Ragg.
And I'm assuming the applause wasn't for me upon standing. And it's a pleasure to speak in this debate today under your chairmanship. And I'm sorry to start my speech on such a downbeat note, but I feel I must express regret at the levels of intolerance that have sadly crept into public discourse on Brexit, both before and even more so since the referendum. Intolerance in the form of racism and xenophobia is deplorable, particularly due to its tendency to lead to hate and violence, and I condemn examples wherever they are found. They must be rooted out and face the full force of the law. However, a new kind of intolerance has emerged in this country, demonstrated by those who proclaim to be the most progressive, broad-minded, and dedicated to supposedly democratic ideals, when they show themselves to be the opposite with this petition. They are intolerant of the view of their fellow citizens who happen to vote to leave the European Union. But conscious of your guidance, Mr. Gray, I shan't seek to rerun the referendum campaign. We should not treat the public as fools, which this petition does. And we should remember, if you ask a question, the answer might not always be the one you expected or hoped for. Now, more than 2 months on from the referendum, that clamouring has not ceased. As this motion to rerun the referendum typifies, as does this weekend's anti-Brexit rally, in which the pinnacle point of interest seemed to be that somebody had their beret stolen. It typifies a rather unsettling desire to thwart or overturn the properly exercised democratic will of the country. While I understand the strength of feeling people hold on this issue, the behaviour and the impetus behind this petition reminds me, sadly, of people going through the 7 stages of grief. And they only, there's 5 indeed, for my honourable friend, more learned on this matter, but they seem to have got stuck somewhere between stage 3 and now oscillate wildly between denial, anger and bargaining. Now, I would stand here and tell those who want a second referendum or to block Article 50, whenever that might come about in the fullness of time, I could simply say, rather churlishly perhaps, that they should pull themselves together, that they should have confidence in themselves, and that they should show a bit of faith in their country. However, I realise that is far too blunt. So I'll gently say this to honourable members who may find sympathy with this petition. Have the good grace to accept the result of the referendum, see the opportunities that lie ahead, and cherish the fact that you represent your constituents in this place, making a difference to their lives here in the mother of all parliaments. Mr. Gray, I want to end my brief remarks by making mention of the late Peter Shaw, a great Eurosceptic Labour politician. During the course of the referendum, an extract of his speech at the Oxford Union on the eve of the 75 referendum became somewhat of a hit on social media. I too was very taken with it. He warned his audience 40 years ago not to despise the chance of their fellow citizens to exercise their democratic right to make a choice at the referendum. He argued passionately that Britain belonged to the world rather than to the narrow confines of the EEC. And he closed by reminding his audience that our parliamentary sovereignty, our democracy, was not just one generation's to fritter away, but was the inheritance of generations of our fellow countrymen and women. Mr. Gray, I can think of no finer trio and reasons to conclude my remarks today, and I urge the rejection of the petition before us.
I'm most grateful to the Honourable Hazelgrove for being so brief. Perhaps other colleagues could follow his excellent example. Tom Brake.
I'd just like to start by picking up on a couple of points that the Right Honourable Member for Tottenham made. He referred to apprenticeship cuts And of course, it was issues about apprenticeships, training, which I think drove many people in the north, for instance, actually to vote for Brexit. So the fact that now the government are cutting that is actually going to exacerbate the problem. He also referred to legislation. And I would wonder whether he'd like to speculate on whether in practice ministers on that side, when they are presented with the opportunity to delete, I think it's 7,000 pieces of EU-related legislation, whether in fact they will actually want to do that in preference to promoting whatever the key project within their department is. Whether it's something on reforming the health service, whether it's reforms to do with education, I suspect that actually that legislation is going to sit there for a very long time because ministers will have no interest whatsoever in getting rid of it. Now, to come to the subject, because I'm sure that Mr. Gray, you'll not allow me to deviate for much longer, I'd like to congratulate the member for Weston-super-Mare for focusing exclusively on the subject of the petition. I'm going to do so perhaps slightly more loosely than him, but I will focus on the issue of the second referendum. I agree with him that there is a strong case for a debate about whether perhaps in future referenda, if there is not a strong majority for constitutional change and a significant turnout, that perhaps that's a matter that we could look at again. But what we have before us today, I think, is actually the issue of whether, in relation to the referendum that has just taken place, whether there should be a second referendum. And my starting point is that there should not be a second referendum simply for the purpose of overturning the referendum that we have just had. It's very clear that, notwithstanding, I'm afraid, that I think the Leave campaign lied blatantly throughout the campaign. I accept that the Remain campaign also perhaps over-egged the pudding in relation to some claims that were made, but in a second I will. But I think particularly on the issue of the NHS, for instance, so the pledge for 350 million per week for the NHS that would happen when we left the European Union. I wrote to the Secretary of State for Health about this, and I got a response from the junior minister. And what he said in his response was, firstly, neither the department nor its ministers were involved in making or endorsing the statement that additional funding would go towards the NHS if the UK were to leave the EU. So if anyone was in any doubt, the Department for Health made it very clear they're not expecting to get any more money as a result of our departure from the European Union. I'm happy to give way.
Gentlemen, for giving way. And for the sake of fairness, I think we should say that on both sides there were outrageous claims. And I want to spell them out for the record. I mean, the punishment budget didn't happen. The restrictive budget since 1936 did not happen as a consequence of us voting to leave. And I'd also like to, I'm still waiting for the house prices in London to go down 20% so that I can actually buy a property.
I would only say to the honourable gentleman that we're only sort of 2 months away from that referendum having taken place. And I think rather than him saying everything's hunky-dory, he might want to wait a little bit longer just to see whether everything is going according to his plan. But on the subject of the second referendum, so no, I don't believe that there should be an immediate second referendum, because I don't think we can have a never-ending referendum, as the honourable gentleman for Weston-super-Mare said. However, what I do think, as I think others have indicated, the honourable member, right honourable member for Tottenham, is that once the UK government have negotiated a deal, so once Article 50 has been triggered and the UK government has spent up to 2 years identifying what it wants to secure from the European Union, from a trade and other aspects of the negotiations, which I imagine will happen, the end of that process will probably be in about 3 years' time from now, because I don't think the Prime Minister is going to be invoking Article 50 at the beginning of next year, possibly mid-year, possibly even towards the end of next year. So 2 years from then, 3 years from now, once the UK government have identified what it is that they are seeking to negotiate with or secure from the European Union, I think then at that point, I would be very surprised indeed if the British public didn't feel there was a need for them to have their say in relation to the outcome of those negotiations before the 2-year period is exhausted and the UK exits the European Union. Now, on the subject of Article 50, I'm very surprised that the people on the Brexit side who campaigned so heavily for sovereignty during that campaign, sovereignty was key, apparently, to many of their concerns, that when Parliament asked to be given the sovereign right to debate and vote on Article 50, that all of a sudden sovereignty isn't such a big issue after all, that actually Parliament should not be sovereign in relation to the triggering of Article 50 at all. And I would ask them to check whether they're being entirely consistent in the arguments that they are deploying. So I think that Article 50 is something not only we should be allowed to debate, as was suggested, but indeed is something that we should be allowed to vote on. Now, my personal position in relation to Article 50 is that actually I think Article 50 goes hand in hand with Brexit, and having accepted the vote, I think I would find it very difficult to try and block Article 50, because I think the two things are connected. You can't vote to leave and then try and block Article 50. Those things, I think, are in effect a package. But as I said, at the end of the negotiations, the protracted negotiations, which incidentally, I was hoping we would hear something about them during the exiting the European Union, the first statement from our leading Secretary of State on what he has been able to negotiate over the summer holidays. Well, I had to leave, Mr. Gray, to get here for this debate, but certainly, I suppose 15 minutes in, we were still at the level of platitudes. There was absolutely no substance whatsoever to what he was delivering. So I don't know what he's done for the last 2 months. Maybe he went off and had a long holiday, but certainly he has not been focusing on what Brexit means. Well, we know that Brexit means Brexit, but we know that as a completely vacuous statement. So I hope, Mr. Gray, that I have kept to the subject, which is the issue of the second referendum. And then finally, what I would say is that if the UK government has secured, at the end of the discussions they've had with the European Union, substantial protection of rights for EU citizens and UK citizens, whose position is completely unclear at present, and they want clarity. They have secured very substantial freedom of movement and the continuation of the UK in the single market. They have maintained the environmental standards that the EU has in some cases enforced on the UK, that law enforcement and judicial cooperation continue at the level that they are currently sort of maintained at an EU level. And the Minister did say or the Secretary of State said in the statement in the Chamber that was an area the government wanted to expand on, so that is welcome. As long as we have secured protection of Erasmus, that the travel and tourism benefits that we derive from being in the European Union and the rights of the city have been maintained, as long as our government have been able to negotiate that package, I'm confident that if this were put to a second referendum about 3 years from now, the British people would feel that that was a package of substance which I think they will be willing to support. Thank you, Mr. Gray.
Lilly.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. And I apologise to you and to the Chamber for not being here at the beginning of the debate, because I was in the main chamber questioning the Secretary of State on his statement on this very subject. But I doubt if any speaker today has or actually will take the words of this petition literally. It would condemn us to go on having referenda so long as neither side gets 60% of the vote, or even if one side does, if the turnout is less than 75%. It's a recipe not for a second referendum, but for a neverendum. It's essentially an emotional call by an unprecedented number of our fellow citizens to set aside the results of the referendum. And they back this up with a number of arguments. First, they argue, and we've heard it argued today, that the Leave side won by lying. Accusations of lying are, of course, a feature of all election campaigns, but free elections provide us with an opportunity to rebut contentious points made by the other side. And in particular, the Remain campaign
with the frequent help of the BBC, repeatedly rubbished the slogan on the Leave battle bus, which highlighted our gross EU contribution of £350 million a week and implied we could spend it on the NHS. Now, I personally never use that figure. I always referred to Britain's net contribution of nearly £10 billion, some £200 million a week. I didn't meet a single voter who changed their mind on finding that the net contribution was only £200 million rather than £350 million and decided not to vote Leave. Of course.
Can I just assure the right honourable member, to whom I'm grateful for giving way, that there were untold numbers of Labour voters in this country who voted for us to leave the European Union on the basis that they believed £350 million per week extra was going to go into the NHS.
Yeah.
There's no getting away from the commitment that was made there, no wriggling around, oh, it was an aspiration or it was a mistake. That was the commitment that many, many Labour voters believed would be delivered on if we left the European Union.
In that case, let me say two things. First, the honourable member and the Remain side were singularly ineffective in rubbishing it, despite that I heard it being rubbished many times. Secondly, he's saying that working class voters, Labour voters, would have voted to stay if they'd known it was only £200 million a week, but were prepared to vote to leave for £350 million. He's put a price on their vote of the difference between those two sums, which I don't find true. I will continue, if I may. Because if it was a lie for the Leave side to refer to our gross contribution without netting off the money we get back, we're not Remain campaigners just as dishonest to focus on money we get back without mentioning the contribution we make? Yet Remainers frequently claimed, with no rebuttal from the BBC, that the EU gives millions of pounds to universities, to researchers, to farmers, to regions, etc., with no mention that the British taxpayers contribute £2 or £3 for every £1 returned to us. They cannot have it both ways, that it's wrong for one side to mention the gross figure, but not for the other. Now, I doubt if the outcome would have been any different if the Leave battle pass had painted £200 million per week on its side rather than 350. As I said, I meet countless voters who said, my heart is for Leave, but my pocket says stay. They were convinced by Project Fear that they would be worse off if we left the EU. And the Treasury analysis of the immediate economic impacts of leaving the EU said, a vote to leave would represent an immediate and profound shock to our economy. That shock will push our economy into a recession and lead to an increase in unemployment of around 500,000. GDP will be 3.6% smaller. Average real wages will be lower. Inflation higher. Sterling weaker. House prices would be hit and public borrowing would rise compared with a vote to remain. And on top of that, we were promised a punishment budget, which would take away benefits from the sick, the disabled and the elderly. None of those things, I'm happy to say, have occurred. There was some hope from one or two members on the other side that they will occur in due course.
Very grateful, Mr. Gentleman, for giving way. On the punishment budget, doesn't it prove that the former Chancellor was a bluffer on that very point? Because he bluffed. He didn't have a punishment budget. And by extension, his threat to Scotland of not sharing a currency was further evidence of yet another bluff.
On the subject of the second referendum, Mr. Peter Lilly.
Yes, I think the Scottish Nationalists want to refer to the previous referendum, which they lost, but I won't be tempted down that path. Now, Project Fear could have become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I was rather afraid it might. But in fact, in the month or two since the referendum, job listings have been up 8%. On last year, consumer spending is up 1.4%. Manufacturing orders at their highest for 10 months. House builders have reported strong demand. And Moody's are confident that the UK will avoid a recession. That's clearly a disappointment to one or two members on the other side who are hoping for bad news to justify their Project Fear. Now, on one respect, they were right. Sterling is indeed lower. But the IMF, whose boss was, of course, famously once a member of the French national synchronised swimming team, joined in a synchronised campaign of gloom saying that a leave for vote would be bad to very, very bad. The IMF now welcomes the fact that the exchange rate move has removed some, but not all, of sterling's previous overvaluation. Now, had the whole establishment of this country and of international unelected bureaucracies forecast what has occurred rather than what they predicted would occur, I can't help feeling that the result would have been even more emphatically to leave than was the case. Now, the second argument for a second referendum is that the Leave campaign had no plan for Brexit. That's a bit like saying that countries like India, Canada, Australia, or even the American colonies had no plan for independence. Of course they did, and ours is the same. It's to take back control of our laws, our money, and our borders. That's what countries do when they become independent. That's the purpose of it, and that's the plan. By definition, that means we will not be part of the EU internal market. The precise trading arrangements we may have with the EU will depend on what the EU wants to arrange in their interests as well as ours. However, there are only two realistic outcomes, both of which are perfectly acceptable to the UK. Either we go on trading with the either we in future trade with the EU on WTO terms, the same basis as the EU's three biggest trading partners, the US, China, and Russia, trade very successfully with the EU. And that would mean that we face tariffs averaging some 4% on our exports, more than offset by the 12% improvement in competitiveness as a result of the change in sterling. Or we continue to trade on the current tariff-free basis. Neither option should take any complex negotiation. To go from zero tariffs to zero tariffs is quite simple. To go from zero tariffs to the WTO tariffs is quite simple. So we should not be in for a prolonged and unnecessary delay in reaching an agreement on one of those two options. The final argument I want to deal with is that the referendum was only advisory. Now, I debated daily with Remainers, sometimes 3 times a day, and not once did my Remain opponent say to the audience, "Oh, by the way, this referendum's just advisory. If you give us the wrong advice, we'll ignore the results and remain in the EU anyway, or perhaps call another referendum, or vote against the application of the results of the referendum on Article 15. And we'll continue doing so until we get the results." Did any members on the other side tell the audience, can they give me chapter and verse of them telling the audience that they were going to treat the result as advisory and ignore it if they didn't like it? Not one of them did. And now they're pretending that the whole thing was advisory. I forget which member said that that was made clear during the debate. On the contrary, the Secretary of State introducing the referendum bill said this is giving the decision to the British people. The Prime Minister when he launched the campaign on the 22nd of February, said this is a straight democratic decision, staying in or leaving, and no government can ignore that. Having a second negotiation followed by a second referendum is not on the ballot paper. For a Prime Minister to ignore the express will of the British people to leave the EU would not just be wrong, but undemocratic. It was spelt out at the beginning, during, and again in the course of the referendum debate that this was a decisive choice for the British people. If we ignore that choice now and treat the British people with contempt, we are undermining their respect for democracy and proving how little faith we have in it ourselves.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Look, this debate is nominally about the threshold that we should have applied to the EU referendum, the argument being that if Leave or Remain secured less than 60% support on a turnout of less than 75%, then there should be a second referendum. And for the benefit of the Right Honourable Member who has just spoken, the motion arises from a petition that was put down by a Leave campaigner, presumably lacking confidence at the time that his side of the argument would be victorious. Now, this, of course, has become, this debate that we're having has become a proxy not around, for a debate, not around thresholds, but a more substantive debate as to whether we should have this second referendum. So I just will quickly dispose of this issue of thresholds and move to the wider debate that is raging on the main issue. Now, on thresholds, the aim of the petition, for me, is reminiscent of the amendment successfully tabled by our Labour colleague George Cunningham in 1978. So the 1978 Scotland Act, which provided for a referendum on Scottish devolution. And the amendment that, and he was thoroughly opposed to devolution for Scotland, and the amendment that he put down provided for 40% of registered Scottish electors to support devolution for it to go ahead. And his amendment had the effect of killing off devolution then, because although in the poll there was a majority, 51.62%, who voted for Scottish devolution, with 48.38% voting against, the turnout was 64%, which of course meant that just 32.9% of registered electors had actually voted in favour. And just as the honourable member for, the right honourable member for, for Weston-super-Mare pointed out, the institution of that mechanism had the effect of promoting the status quo. Now, I have to say, Mr. Gray, I don't think it's desirable generally to hold lots of referenda, because in the end, our constituents sent us here to make decisions based on a manifesto and a set of values that we put forward. So I think, ideally, we should only trouble our constituents with referenda in the most exceptional of circumstances. And when you've got a major constitutional issue at stake, it seemed to me that there is some justification for doing so. But when we do have these referenda, as was the case here on these kinds of issues, I have to say I'm sceptical about applying the very high threshold that is proposed in the petitioner's petition. I do think there is great difficulty in telling those who have supported the proposition, which on the face of it they appear to have done by a clear majority, to say that it can't be carried because there's been a low turnout. I mean, after all, we are all here, and a low turnout hasn't been an obstacle to any of us being elected. A low turnout or a lack of support for a particular government, this government has the support of less than 25% of registered electors. That hasn't stopped this government taking office. So people will question, well, if you don't have those kind of thresholds and mechanisms that apply to us during an election, why would you then apply it in a referendum position? And I also worry that if we have these thresholds, in effect, what you may end up with is people deliberately seeking to depress turnout in a, what is, wherever you stand on the argument is a thoroughly active democratic exercise, people trying to actually work against that. So, look, I'm not completely closed to any notion of some higher threshold, given there's a constitutional change, but I am sceptical. I'll give way to my friend.
My honourable friend's making an interesting point, but would he agree with me, certainly in the correspondence I received from constituents who'd signed this petition, actually, rather than the detail of thresholds and so on, they were actually reflecting their feelings about this. And I know the honourable member talked about them being emotional or needing to pull themselves together. Actually, this is a real issue here with how people felt about being lied to, about a lack of clarity on the options before them, about a clash of mandates when it comes to devolved administrations, and certainly in terms of the future for Wales. Does he agree with me that there was actually something more fundamental here about how people feel in the aftermath, and we have to do a lot to do to bring people back together?
Yes, I wouldn't disagree with that, and I'll move on from the issue of thresholds. And like I said, I think that the danger with these thresholds is being seen to ignore views on either side, frankly. But I think I'll give way to the honourable member.
As the right honourable knows, then in my constituency of Boston and Skegness, the turnout was 77% and the vote to leave was also 77%. So the point he makes cuts both ways and would, of course, if we were to have a second referendum, then the sense of disempowerment in a constituency such as mine and the sense of going against democracy itself would be palpable.
Yes. Well, no.
I have to say, I agree with Honourable Member, but I was actually going to mention his constituency, which he kind of hosted a visit for me there. For the record, for Hansard's benefit, the Honourable Member who's just spoken represented the area with the highest Leave vote. I represent the area with the highest Remain vote, so I wanted to go and see if we could perhaps heal some of the divisions in society, which have been...
What happened? What happened?
But let me, and that in a way miraculously takes me to the first point I want to make on the substantial issue as to whether, moving away from thresholds, whether we should have a second referendum. And it's this really. The first point is that, yes, I think the referendum clearly delivered a decisive result, but it wasn't a landslide for Leave. Different generations voted differently. I certainly saw that in the honourable member's constituency of Boston and Skegness. Different areas of the UK voted, and we heard about that earlier, and different ethnicities voted in different ways as well. I actually think it's incumbent on all of us, given all of what I've just mentioned, to see how we can actually stitch together this fragile democracy of ours. And it's very much in that spirit that I made the visit to Boston and that I come to this issue. The second issue is this that I wanted to raise. In the Remain camp, it would be disingenuous to deny, and I campaigned all over the country for us to stay in the European Union, Mr. Gray. I led the Labour In for Britain campaign in London. I was one of the main national spokespeople for Britain Stronger in Europe. But I think it would be disingenuous to deny, partly, what has powered this petition. There is a split in the Remain camp that has arisen post the referendum result. Half of the Remainers, so to speak, think Britain's voted to leave. This is what the polls show. And now the government's got a duty to carry out their wishes, get the best deal, and for us to leave the European Union. Slightly less, but around half, and I'm sure many who applauded here would fit into that category, think that we should ignore the vote to leave or simply seek to overturn it by way of the second referendum that we are talking about today. So inevitably, what I'm going to say is probably going to disappoint half the people who I've been campaigning with over the last few months. Now, it's true, there were a lot of overblown claims, misleading promises, and the rest that were parroted by the Leave campaign. And the Honourable Member for Clark-Shulton talked about there being certainly perhaps a few overblown claims on our side as well. But in the end, the Leave campaign won. And it is important that they are held to account now for what follows, because they were the victorious side of the debate. And that's why myself, the Honourable Member for Clark-Shulton, and the members for Wolverhampton North and also North Norfolk, we've set up Vote Leave Watch to scrutinise what comes out of this deal and to seek to ensure that people are held to account. And frankly, it's as much to give a voice to the 48% who voted to remain as it is for the 52% who voted, I'll give way in just one moment, who voted to leave, for them to see whether things have actually been delivered, and in so doing, hopefully, try and forge a national consensus and bring the two together. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
For giving way. Just a quick question on the point that he made with respect to the split in the Remain vote. I mean, given that the Remain vote, as poll suggests, is split, and given that he is a very keen observer of the political scene, does he honestly think that a second referendum held, let's say, within the next year, would overturn the result that we saw on June the 23rd?
I'm going I'll come on to that.
Bearing in mind the clock.
Bearing in mind the clock. I was going to come on to that very point. But I just want to say, the fact that you, as a Remain campaigner, accept the will of the people is not to wave the white flag. It is not to deny that the arguments that we've been making over many months are any less valid. But in the end, we've somehow got to work out how we move forward and do so together. Now, one of the main reasons that I rejected the politics of many of those who voted for us to leave is because I felt that they peddle division. They try and set different groups against each other in our society. I'm not saying everybody did, but a lot of them. And what I worry about in moving straight to this call for a second referendum is actually further dividing up our country. I mean, are we really saying that all of the Leave voters were completely brainwashed by all these misleading claims and myths that were parroted? Are we really saying that they were incapable of taking a step back, taking a view on all the different facts that were being presented by either side and making their own judgment? Are we really saying, frankly, I've heard a lot of this, that they were just brainwashed by a bunch of right-wing tabloid newspapers? Now, I'm sorry, I just don't accept that argument. And I think there's a real danger if we talk like that about people who voted to leave the European Union, that we're simply reinforcing this view that we're some kind of metropolitan elite who know better than other people. And I think there is a real risk that we can be seen to be patronising them. So what are the circumstances in which I would entertain us having a second vote? I think there were a very clear set of promises that were made. £350 million in the NHS, going to the NHS every week. Maintained full access to the single market whilst not having the free movement that goes with it. EU citizens already here being given the right to say. There are a set of clear pledges, as far as I'm concerned, that were given by all the different Vote Leave campaigners. Now, if the deal that is reached is substantially and materially different in the end, at the end of this process, to that many of the Leave voters believed they were promised, it's in those circumstances that I believe you could legitimately ask for there to be a second referendum. But the fact of the matter is, we haven't got to that point yet. And I think if we go straight to it now, we are simply going to further divide our country, where as hard as it is, I say to people, as hard as it is for those of us who I feel emotional talking about it now, as hard as it is that we did not win that referendum, we have got to keep this country of ours together and got to work out how we build those bridges. Regardless of where we sat in that debate, all of us have a duty to do that.
Order, before I call the next speaker, can I just point out that if people restrict themselves to 7 or 8 minutes, we stand a chance of getting everybody in the debate. If they've gone longer than that, then there will be people who will be disappointed at the end of it. Karen Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gray. And I'm very happy to follow the Honourable Member for Streatham, because I think he's made some very, very powerful points. The petition that we're talking about has over 4 million signatures, I think, and to me at least, I think it is an understandable expression of pain and anger in response to what was a bitterly fought EU referendum campaign, which has left this country, as he has said, deeply divided. Pain and anger felt certainly in my own constituency of Brighton Pavilion. It had one of the highest rates of people voting to remain, around 69%, and indeed also one of the highest numbers of people signing this petition, around 19,500 at the last count. But however much many of us might wish the outcome of this referendum had been different, and I certainly do, and however much we might argue that the level of lies and misinformation during the campaign undermines the legitimacy of that outcome, I do agree with those who have said very clearly that the bottom line surely has to be that trying to impose a retrospective threshold and effectively rerun the referendum is bad politics and worse democracy. What better way would there indeed be to reinforce the perception that the so-called metropolitan elites care nothing for those in more distant and perhaps disconnected communities than simply to ignore everything that they have said? Instead, I think that the anger and alienation felt by many who voted Leave urgently needs to be addressed. Because for many, I believe it was a howl of rage against exclusion and powerlessness. And their voices have to be heard, not just at the referendum, but year-round. And I'd argue that a crucial way to do that is to crack open the current political system that encourages the main parties to listen almost exclusively to swing voters in marginal seats at general elections and to ignore everybody else. If we're to set about healing the deep divisions in society which this referendum has laid bare, then one task must be to urgently build a more representative, inclusive democracy, and that can only be brought about through electoral reform. I think if the Brexit campaigners were serious about giving people back control, a good place to start would be democratic control. A political system that delivers government on the basis of just 24% of the eligible vote clearly does not give us that. So, Brexit means Brexit, so we are told. Well, the reason that I believe that we need a second referendum on the terms of any Brexit deal is because I think we have absolutely no idea what is on the other side of that door marked Brexit. We might have chosen to open that door, but we have no idea, not even the dimmest shape, of what on earth is on the other side, even now, 2 months after the vote. Now, the government's alternatives to EU membership, they have a paper on that, gave 4 alternative options. The BBC listed 5. The Centre for European Reform sets out 7. Which of these was voted for by those who were voting Leave? Well, none of them. How many will we end up with? Well, one of them. So what parliamentary scrutiny, or indeed public scrutiny, have we had of an actual plan to leave the EU? Absolutely none, because there wasn't one and there isn't one. And so that is why I strongly support not just maximum parliamentary scrutiny, but calls for a further referendum too on the terms of Brexit once they are clear, and on our future relationship with the EU, so that we can all assess what that actually looks like in the real world. Because during the campaign, when pressed on the alternative to EU membership, Leave campaigners would squeal that they couldn't possibly be expected to answer those questions because they weren't a government in waiting, but rather they wanted the British people to be in control. Well, what would fulfil that promise more thoroughly than ensuring the public gets the opportunity to cast a positive vote for what a potential Brexit looks like, in addition to their vote against remaining part of the EU? And before that referendum on the terms of Brexit takes place, I think lessons absolutely must be learnt, and the government needs to take a long, hard look at the Electoral Reform Society's report called Doing Referendums Differently. Let me just quote a few things from it. They say there were glaring democratic deficiencies in the run-up to the vote, with previously unreleased polling showing that far too many people felt they were ill-informed about the issues. It goes on, the top-down, personality-based nature of the debate failed to address major political policies and subjects, leaving the public in the dark. And finally, misleading claims could be made with impunity. And that report calls for a root and branch review of referendums, learning the lessons of the EU campaign to make sure the mistakes that were made in terms of regulation, tone and conduct are never repeated. And I would absolutely echo that call. Because it is clear that there was so much misinformation, and yes, it was on all sides, but I do believe that on the Leave side that was particularly egregious. We were told that we could end freedom of movement and keep full access to the single market. We were told we could continue to benefit from being part of the single market, yet somehow take back control. I will in just 2 seconds, and make all of our rules here in the UK and cease having to follow EU rules. And then the famous £350 million a week for the NHS. Truth is, we won't have any extra money, let alone an amount anywhere near the lie of all lies that disgrace the side of a perfectly innocent bus for months on end. I give way.
Is the Honourable Lady aware that the EU has free trade agreements with some 50 countries, only 3 of which have in return granted free movement of labour and made a contribution to the EU? All 3 because their governments were planning to enter the EU. The other 47 have free trade agreements with no free movement, no contribution. Why should we be different?
Lucas.
Is the Right Honourable Gentleman aware that there is a wealth of difference between free trade and being part of the single market? He has talked on at length about tariff barriers. The big issue about membership of the WTO is non-tariff barriers. You know, he really should keep up with where the debate is at, because that is where it's at right now. All of this focus on tariffs was a very clever red herring for most people that don't know about trade agreements, but I've actually studied trade agreements. I've worked on them for years, and I can tell him there is a wealth of difference between trade agreements and membership of the single market, and that was yet another lie perpetrated during this referendum campaign. Going forward, we need people to be given a say and to have real control over the terms of any Brexit deal. We need maximum public engagement and parliamentary scrutiny, and that means the government must set out its plan for what it wants Brexit to look like. It needs to present it to the people, I believe, in an early general election to secure a mandate that currently it does not have. And then it needs to ensure full and proper parliamentary debate and scrutiny, and only then allow MPs to vote on whether to invoke Article 50 and set in train the formal process of leaving, so we know what direction that train is going in. In addition, we should be arguing for wider public engagement, giving opportunities for meaningful input throughout the process, as well as maximising input from civil society organisations, NGOs, charities, businesses, local authorities and other stakeholders. To claim that we want to take back control of the UK's future, but to refuse measures to maximise parliamentary and public scrutiny, I think is unforgivable, I think it's contradictory, and I think it's harmful. So, Greens argued during the referendum campaign that outside the EU there's a very real danger the UK will seek to compete with other countries by weakening social and environmental protections and by becoming effectively a tax haven. That is still the case. So I think that in this debate running up to a second referendum on the terms of a Brexit, some of the key issues that we'll be wanting to keep in mind in terms of how we might vote on that second referendum will be things like whether or not we can maintain freedom of movement and full rights of EU citizens in the UK, whether we can continue to have full access to the single market, whether we can have crucially important environmental protections that we currently enjoy thanks to our EU membership, whether that's on air or water or wildlife, and not just keeping what we have, we should be improving that and absolutely locking that down in law. And one of the big concerns I think people have right now is about what is going to happen to things like the Habitats Directive, the Birds Directive. These are gold standard when it comes to environmental protection. And what we need to see is those preserved in any new environmental settlement. That needs to be perhaps in a new environmental act, But whatever happens, we must not see a race to the bottom in terms of standards. We need to retain EU-derived workers' rights, social and consumer protections and human rights, again as a bare minimum that we should seek to build on. We should be putting young people first. And finally, I believe that we should be asking the government right now to make a guarantee to EU nationals who've made this country their home in good faith, that the government should say right now that they are welcome to stay, they have an absolute right to stay. Anything less than that is simply using people's lives as cynical chips in a bargaining negotiation, and that is neither right nor moral.
Mr. James Cleverly.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship. About a month before the referendum, when a result for the Remain campaign was widely expected to be successful, I was asked on Newsnight if I would respect the result of a close Remain vote. And I said at that point that even if Remain won by only one vote, I would respect the decision. And I note the point made by the member for Streatham that the petition was actually started by someone campaigning for leave, perhaps in the expectation of a Remain win. And had that outcome happened, had Remain been victorious in the referendum, and had this petition come before this committee, I would stand up now and give fundamentally the same speech that I am going to give. That I would respect, or I do respect, the outcome of the referendum, and I would suggest that a second referendum would be completely inappropriate. So this is not driven by the result of the referendum. This is driven by what I believe to be a fundamental cornerstone of the democratic process. The question on the ballot paper, irrespective of what people have said or might say in this debate, was clear and unambiguous. The question was whether or not the UK should leave the EU. And there have been people who have spoken in this debate and who I've spoken with about this issue, who have attempted to retrofit a whole series of implied other questions into that referendum question. Questions about the nature of sovereignty, the nature of international trade, the nature of border controls. These are not unimportant questions, but they are not and were not the questions on the ballot paper. The question on the ballot paper was clear and it was unambiguous. And to suggest that somehow it was other than that, I think is grossly unfair. It has also been mentioned by a number of people speaking that the government should be forced to abide by the campaign ideas of Vote Leave. I understand the thinking behind that, but it is worth remembering that Vote Leave was a cross-party, single-issue campaign group. There were Conservative members, Conservative politicians on Vote Leave. There were Labour politicians on Vote Leave, UKIP politicians on Vote Leave. I believe there may be Lib Dem supporters, if not politicians. There was a member of the Green Party on the Vote Leave campaign. It was a just one, I know, but there nonetheless. It was a cross-party campaign. It is ridiculous to demand that a Conservative government be forced to deliver the agenda of a cross-party campaign group. No one with any credibility would demand that the Prime Minister had the Remain campaign won. No one would demand the Prime Minister bring Will Straw into the heart of government to start dictating government policy in that circumstance. However, I will give way.
He didn't even intervene.
He caught my eye. He caught my eye.
To the honourable gentleman for giving way, and he and I have had many debates in the course of the referendum campaign. I'm sorry, I don't accept the point that he is making in terms of accountability, and I think there's a complete contradiction, if I may say so. Many of the people on the Leave side who made accountability and transparency key cornerstones of their campaign, now when people seek to hold legitimately people who are members of the government who voted to leave to account for pledges that they made, to now say, oh, somehow there shouldn't be any accountability, for me is contradictory and not acceptable.
Order. Just before the honourable gentleman responds, the wind-ups will start at 7 o'clock. By my maths, there are at least 5 or 6 people wishing to speak. I do hope that honourable members will bear that in mind. Mr. James Cleverly.
I'm grateful, Mr. Chairman. The honourable member for Streatham preempts my next paragraph, so I thank him. I thank him for that, and you can read the speech to prove that I'm not retrofitting this. But whilst it is not incumbent upon the government to take on board the campaign ideas, the campaign slogans of Vote Leave, it would be very unwise of any government to ignore some of the fundamental issues which obviously came to the fore during the referendum campaign. For example, a desire for greater sovereignty of the country, domestic sovereignty of the country, a desire for the reprioritisation of government spending to domestic expenditure, like, for example, a significant upturn in spending on the National Health Service, control of borders, greater international trade, and other things that were brought up during the campaign. And it is without a doubt that the government, through the process of this negotiation, and in the aftermath of our exit, will need to put forward a credible plan to the British people on those issues and a whole host of others to have a realistic chance of being returned to government. And this brings me to my fundamental point. The way parliamentary democracy works, the way parliamentary accountability works, is that prospective governments should put forward their ideas. Those ideas should be voted on by the British people, and those governments should be held to account for the delivery or otherwise of that agenda. The chronology of this is actually really quite helpful. We are likely to see over the next couple of years Article 50, we'll see relatively soon, I suspect, Article 50 invoked. Then over the next couple of years, as timetabled by Article 50, we'll see a negotiated position. And that negotiated position will be in the public domain, I suspect, in the lead up to the 2020 general election. And the Prime Minister, no doubt, will put forward the Conservative plan for what Brexit looks like in real terms. The immigration policy, the public spending policy, the trade policy, defence policy, etc., etc. I'm sure the Labour Party, I'll rephrase that, I hope the Labour Party will be able to put forward an agenda for what their impression of Brexit would look like, their public spending priorities, their immigration plans, their international trade plans. Liberal Democrats, Scottish National Party will do likewise. And if one of those parties wishes to say, actually, you know what, none of those deals on the table are good enough, and what we will do is to rejoin the EU or overturn the explicit mandate from the EU referendum, good luck to you. Put that up in front of the British people, and let's see what they come up with. I give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving me, certainly painting quite a tempting scenario. Isn't it the case, first of all, that once Article 50 is triggered, the United Kingdom does not have the unilateral right to integrate it? If we don't have a negotiated deal within 2 years, Europe is then entitled to tell us what the deal is. Secondly, is it not the case that deciding to remain in the European Union is relatively straightforward? For the United Kingdom to try to get back in after we've left, the United Kingdom just now fails the democracy test and would not be eligible for EU membership if it was applying to come back in as a new member state.
James Cleverly.
I take the point on board, and whilst I disagree with some of the fundamentals underlying this question, it is a valid question nonetheless. But that is the status quo. And that kind of brings me ultimately to the point, in fact, I will take an intervention and then I'll come to my concluding points.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. He's been very generous. Does he not accept that there is another fundamental problem? In issues where competence is wholly devolved, take, for example, agriculture, fisheries, environmental policy in relation to Wales, I'm sure other devolved administrations as well, which weren't the case when we went into the EU originally, that those matters are now devolved. There's not even any legislation on, for example, Welsh fisheries. It's an England-Wales matter, but it is devolved. That's going to have to start from scratch. Does he not accept that the Welsh Assembly and the Welsh Government should have full say on any package that's put together? Forget about whether we have a say here in Parliament, but at the very least that's got to be the case as well.
Order. I absolutely agree the honourable gentleman is being very generous. There are now 45 minutes left and there are still 6 people wishing to speak. Mr James Cleverly.
I'll wrap those up in my conclusion. These are serious questions. I do not pretend that I am an expert on regional devolved government. I've come from London government and I know the settlement is different in various parts of the country. I'm not going to try and second guess how that might play out. There will be lots of legislation. We are going to be very busy. There's no two ways about that. But, as this has been raised before, this referendum result is not like declaring independence from a colonial power in all respects, but in some respects it is. In that, the future is by definition unwritten. And political parties go into general elections outlining their vision for the future and they get tested by the electorate. And the nature of devolved government, whether it be to Scotland or to Wales, to London, to wherever, will be part of that. But I would conclude by saying, those calling for a second referendum, be careful what you wish for. Because if this motion were ultimately to be put through, you have to understand that the status quo is that we are leaving the EU. That is the status quo. If this ultimately were to be successful, and if a second referendum were to be put to the British people on this new set of criteria, the status quo hurdle that you would seek to overcome with that turnout threshold and with that 3/4 or three-fourths threshold would be the status quo that we leave the EU. Everyone recognises that uncertainty is bad for business, it's unsettling to families. If we were to go down the route of talking about a second referendum, we would introduce a whole load of new uncertainty that would be destabilising for families, would be bad for business, and I strongly urge all members to reject this, to move forward, to deliver Brexit in a way that is beneficial to the British people. And if you want to put forward your version of what the future might look like, do so at the general election and be tested by the British people at that point.
My fellow member of the Petitions Committee for introducing this debate, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir David. In June 2010, I made my maiden speech by choice in a debate on European affairs because I wanted to highlight the importance of the EU funding to the North East. And I said in that speech, as a region, we stand stronger and we will not accept the government dismantling our strength by withdrawing regional support. Little did I imagine that 6 years later, Newcastle upon Tyne would be the first in the country to declare by the narrowest of margins that it wanted to remain in the EU and that the rest of the North East would vote to leave. I do fully appreciate that those voting to leave had many reasons for doing so, and it didn't just include those pushed to the margins of society. In the words of the recent report published by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, I also know that I have many constituents who voted to leave, and they want Brexit to go ahead as soon as possible. And indeed, a relatively small number have contacted me to very much express that view. However, over 90% of those who have got in touch with me have expressed serious concerns about the referendum and its outcome, including some who voted leave and now regret that decision. A very common cause for concern is the basis on which the referendum was fought. I know that outlandish assertions were made on both sides of the debate, but we know that the Leave campaign did make a number of very high-profile claims about the benefits of Britain leaving the EU, which were either demonstrably untrue or simply impossible for them to commit to. Of course, the most misleading was given an air of legitimacy by the misuse of the NHS logo by Vote Leave, something which I wrote to the Health Minister during the campaign and which I understand the NHS has sought legal advice. I know of at least one frontline health worker in Newcastle who decided to vote Leave on the basis of the additional £350 million a week being directed to the NHS. Therefore, I disagree with the honourable member, the right honourable gentleman, unlike the honourable gentleman for Weston-super-Mare, I agree that the Electoral Reform Society recent conclusion that we need to do referendums differently should be looked at, and particularly an official body being set up with the task of intervening when misleading claims are made in future campaigns. Many constituents also contacted me about the highly divisive and unpleasant nature of the referendum campaign. I fully acknowledge that feelings on Britain's membership of the EU have run very high for many years. However, to exploit these feelings and stir up bigotry against those who appear to be different is unforgivable. A Britain that seeks to divide people is not a Britain that I want my or anyone else's children to grow up in, and I find it incredibly distressing that anyone should be made to feel unwelcome or worse as a result of this process. It's quite clear that that has happened, and it is being made worse by the government's continued failure to confirm the long-term future of EU nationals in the UK. But perhaps the biggest single concern that my constituents have conferred to me is the failure of the government to anticipate or plan for the outcome of the referendum. The new Chancellor may have told the Foreign Affairs Select Committee that he did not see the need for contingency planning, but it frankly beggars belief. Indeed, one of my constituents says that he was left horrified by the situation, and I would suggest that there are many in the country who are frankly incredulous that the government could have put this question to the British public without at least considering the possibility that they did not get the answer that they wanted. We now face weeks, months, even years of prolonged uncertainty about what Brexit really means, as we try and work through the incredible intricacies of extrapolating ourselves from the EU. What will Brexit mean for the countless individuals across the UK whose lives will be directly impacted by leaving the EU, such as two of my constituents who came to see me who've worked in the EU for a decade, but they have no idea what will happen to their pension contributions that they've made during that time? What will happen to our driving licence, our European health insurance cards, once Article 50 is triggered? A pretty important question to the millions of British citizens who regularly travel to the EU for work or indeed holidays. Under what circumstances will North East firms be able to trade their goods and services both to the EU and non-EU countries in the future? This knowledge is crucially important to the only region in the UK which consistently exports more than it imports, with some 58% of North East exports currently going to the EU. What will happen to EU nationals who've made a life for themselves in the North East, such as 1,000 people who work in the NHS and the 600 university staff? Just two examples. Indeed, as one constituent has asked me, what is the timescale for leaving the EU so that industry, academic institutions and other organisations have sufficient time to prepare? Crucially, what will happen to the £726 million of European funding due to come to the North East over the next 5 years? Not least because the North East has only received 20% of its EU funding allocation so far. And how will the government ensure that the devolution deal, which is still apparently on the table for our region, is meaningful, given it was largely underpinned by EU funding that the North East was due to receive? Indeed, to what extent will the North East be involved in the Brexit negotiations? Because Britain leaving the EU will clearly have a profound effect on my region, and I share the determination of the North East Combined Authority that our voice is heard as loudly as anybody else's throughout this process. And how will the government be held accountable for any of this? These are just some of the many, many unanswered questions about what Brexit actually means, and until we have them, we won't even know what Britain voted for in this referendum. And that is the crux of the matter, because nobody who voted on the 23rd of June could possibly have known what life outside of the EU will actually look like. And more than 2 months on from the referendum, we are no closer to the truth. The North East will work together to make the best of this mess, but in order to do so, we need answers to all of these questions quickly.
Ian Paisley.
Sir David, it's an honour to serve today under your chairmanship of this Westminster Hall debate. Almost 2 hours into this debate, there's actually been unanimity in this room. No one has actually said that they want to rerun the referendum. And despite the fact that there's been some fraught between each side, it actually has found that agreement. Now, people, when they were speaking, may not have believed that. Indeed, people in the public gallery may have hoped for something else. People who signed that e-petition may have been hoping for something else. But the fact of the matter is that no one has said, let's run the referendum. And I think that's actually a good thing, because I certainly don't want to see the referendum taking place again for a number of reasons, and I will outline them to you. But I did feel at some point and I feel sorry for my friend from Scotland who was called to order, but rightly so called to order, that some of his arguments that he's putting forward, I think the House maybe felt a little bit how Moses must have felt when he said to the children of Israel, I'm going to take you to a land that's flowing with milk and honey. I'm going to take you to a promised land. Follow me out of slavery. Leave the building of these terrible buildings for the Egyptians. We'll take you there. And after a few steps out of Egypt, they said, oh, let's go back. We can't really see where we're going. We don't like this. There's a big sea in front of us that won't part its ways. We have to find a different way. But unfortunately, I think that's how Moses must have felt. And I think, therefore, we can maybe take some hope out of this, because at the end of the day, there is a promised land, there is a better place, and it will be when we Brexit fully and completely for the EU. I will very briefly. I'm only going to give way this once, and you're the lucky contender.
To continue his analogy, does he share my fear that we might be walking around in the wilderness for 40 years?
Well, actually, I love it, because the analogy is brilliant. Because for the last 40 years, we've been walking in the wilderness of the EU. And at last we see the promised land, and we are getting there. So I do think that, and we're only 4 months into this. Not even 4 months into this, and I think that the promised land, the horizon is more than there. But I do agree with something that has been said by an earlier contributor, I'm not giving away again because it is unfair in the other 5 speakers, that it would be a real slap in the face if we did what some people want us to do, and that's have this vote again. And it would actually say to the people, you know, you voted, but damn you, we're going to make you vote again until we get the right result. And people have talked about urban elites and metropolitan elites and all the rest of it. It would just frankly be arrogant. We are here as the servants of the people. We must do as servants what the people have asked us to do. We very seldom trouble the people at referenda. And we must know, I'm not giving way again, I've said that very clear, I'm not giving way because it's unfair and the other 5 people want to speak. No, I'm not giving way, I've made it clear, Mr. Chairman, I've made it clear I'm not giving way. That it'd be unfair when we trouble the people and we say to them, give us your view. We then say, damn you, we're going to ignore you. And that would be absolutely immoral and absolutely wrong. I would also say, and I agree with the other point that's been made in this debate, that we have to be very careful what we ask for. If we're going to say in the future there's going to be huge thresholds, and if sometime in the future, and we all know it'd be madness, but if sometime in the future someone crazy decided that they would have a referendum on, say, Scotland leaving the Union, if someone decided to pursue that crazy notion, and the wrong result, because we decided it was the wrong result, emerged, or there wasn't enough votes for the wrong result, and we said, let's have it again until you give us the result we want, I would feel insulted for the Scottish people then, as I feel insulted now when some people tell me, because you voted leave, it's not the right result, we've got to have that vote again. That's immoral, it's wrong, it's anti-democratic, and it's about time we actually listen to the people and put in place what the people want, even if for some of us it is distasteful and it's not what we actually want to do. I want to turn very briefly to the petition itself. I've been told by some people who've emailed me, those keyboard warlords in my constituency. You better turn up at this debate and vote in a particular way and have a rerun of this referendum, because thousands of us have signed this petition. Well, of course, I looked very closely at the petition, and I've heard some of the arguments, but 2,479 people signed that petition or emailed in that petition from my constituency. Frankly, Mr. Chairman, I get larger petitions for rural potholes in my constituency, and that's not a joke. I got a petition with thousands and thousands more. In my constituency, I'm talking about the 2,400, thousands and thousands more for caravan legislation in the last Parliament. And I think we have to remember that as parliamentarians, we have to avoid having the view that we're ruled by the tap of a keyboard. Because someone taps send on a keyboard, we better crack to that. We better jump to that particular order. We take our judgment seriously, and we're here, as Burke said, to give our judgment and to give of our industry. We're not here to be, at the click of a keyboard, told that's the way you should be voting in the future. And I think we should all, as parliamentarians, take that responsibility very seriously indeed, because that is our role and that is our job. Also, there was huge tens of thousands of people who signed that petition were fraudulent. And whilst I'm not dismissing the millions who genuinely have signed it, there were tens of thousands. Already 77,000 been wiped out of it because of that. But I looked through it today. Someone signed it from the Solomon Islands. People have signed it, tens of thousands, from France. Well, frankly, one of the reasons why we voted to leave the EU is because we want to take decisions about ourselves and about our own country and not jump to the will of people outside of this country. And I think, therefore, we should not allow ourselves to be bullied by petitions. We should do what the people have told us to do and implement that properly. Finally, I want to look very briefly at some of the arguments that have been put forward, and I agree with them again, that the debate has not been good enough, that the debate was flawed on all sides. And I think we could all take that view. But I was many a time during the Leave campaign when I tried to raise agricultural issues about the importance of making sure that we had an agricultural deal post-Brexit. I was told, oh no, this is not about that detail, this is about sovereignty. Get on to that. That's what you must talk about. And then when I got onto sovereignty, the same people on the Remain side were saying, oh, but what about farmers? What will they do? What will they do for their single farm payment? The fact of the matter is, that is the nature of the maelstrom that we're in when we're in politics, that we have to make those arguments. And if we fail to make those arguments right, then it's upon us, but it's also upon the media for not allowing, at times, a proper debate on many of those issues, that they weren't interested in pursuing the details of what we were saying. Part of our campaign, we produced a 100-page document on many of the detailed key issues about trade negotiations in the future and what that would look at. It got a tiny line in the newspaper, and then it went off on something else altogether. So I think we have to remember that the media have some responsibility to bear in terms of the future, if there is a referendum in the future and any other subject, that there is a proper and fulsome debate. Of course, now we have the madness that if there's bad news at all occurring, it's all because of Brexit. But if there's any good news, it's because there hasn't been a Brexit yet. Now, you can't have that. You can't have that nonsense. The fact of the matter is that we are moving to Brexit. And I believe the faster we get there, the better for clarity and for all of our country and for all of our people's sake. And I would say to those people, especially the man who introduced the motion today, my colleague introduced the motion today before us, who's a great lad from Scotland. We get on, Bonnie Scotland, we get on very, very well with him. And he's my namesake and everything else. But it does sound a bit like being a bad loser when this sort of thing is introduced. We actually have to do is pull together and get the best deal for the entirety of the United Kingdom.
17,500 people, nearly 17,500 people signed this petition that we're debating today, and 72% of my constituents wanted to remain. So I'm here on their behalf. And when the enormity of the results set in on that night, I remember that the rest of the country hadn't gone the same way. I was saying to people that if a vote came to it and it was on the repeal of the 1972 European Communities Act, I'd have no hesitation in voting against. But we're not talking about that today, are we? It's this petition which has specific things on it. That any referenda should have a 60% vote one way or the other, and that there should be a 75% turnout. And I think in answer to that, the government has already said that this was a democratic exercise in which 33 million people had their say, and that you can't move the goalposts after. And I do accept that. There's a logic to that you can't rerun a football match if you had the result you didn't want. I was in Iceland this summer. They had the match ball of that horrible game just to rub it into the wounds of English holidaymakers. So I accept all that. But I mean, Sir David, I would say that this is a case that, I mean, there is no other parallel, there is no other precedent to what we've done. I mean, people say 2016 is one of those years that proves that thing, may you live in interesting times. It's a curse, I think. There's been a lot of these celebrity deaths, David Bowie, Alan Rickman, who lived in Acton, Muhammad Ali. I think for a lot of my constituents, it is a grieving process. The saddest thing of all is Britain in the EU, RIP, because the probability of death is always one in life, and this was not inevitable, I think, the way a lot of my constituents see this. And that this was meant to put the lid on it. This was meant to put it to bed. It was a Prime Minister who was cowed by his own internal politics. This was meant to signal a full stop, but it feels like we've uncorked a genie from a bottle, opened a Pandora's box, a can of worms, whichever cliche you use. And the consequences are much wider ranging than any normal piece of legislation, because this is 40 years of lawmaking that will have to be undone. It's not going to be an easy process. These two new government departments in place, and we've all had these anecdotes, stories of, I was talking to the head of Grange School this morning, who said that the day after, the Friday after, he said parents rather than children in tears of settled EU population that were fearing the worst, that people would be saying, get home now. I mean, apparently it hasn't been as bad as they thought, but this kind of thing, people that have lost contracts, business people. We have a lot of Japanese residents in my seat as well, a lot of these Japanese countries that are saying that companies that they work for that are saying they'll take their wares elsewhere. So, I mean, I guess we are where we are, though. I mean, again, I campaign to remain in. I'm a sort of person who's into building bridges, not constructing walls, unlike the Donald Trump in America. I was disappointed by the result. I mean, I've got to accept that the sky has not fallen in yet. But, I mean, there is an argument that referenda are quite un-British anyway. Why were we having this at all? I mean, some people in our party blame our current leader. I think if it's one person whose door we can lay this out, it is the Prime Minister. We're not Switzerland. I would say that this kind of, and this argument that we shouldn't trust experts, I think there's a good weight of expert opinion that seemed to have gone out of the window with all this. The template seemed to have been set, the 3-hour statement that the then Prime Minister did when we came back, the Monday after. 3 hours of questions he got on all sorts of different aspects, the Brexit hate crime, all the economic stuff. And the two responses he seemed to have was that we must accept the will of the people. And the second one was that is a matter for my predecessor. Those seem to be the two things in either order that he said to everything. I mean, we can't... my successor. Sorry, he was the predecessor to his successor. Yeah, you're right. Okay. But look, we can't carry on with business as usual because things have been so drastically altered, the political settlement that will come ahead. So I'd argue that some kind of safeguards do need to be put in place if we ever have referenda again in this country. So, I mean, I think some safety valve safeguards are an absolute necessity, not just a feasible prospect. Now, the level of thresholds, this is quite high, really. 60% have to vote one way or another, 75% turnout. I think the Prime Minister was probably thinking, the Right Honourable Member for Witney, that it would go the way of some of his other referenda. So there was the one in 2011 on AV. That was a turnout of 42%, and it was 69%, so it satisfied one of them, but not the other. So, I mean, there is something in the argument that it would protect us from close calls. I don't know where you would set the numbers exactly. But, I mean, it does seem, everyone is baffled by, I think there's limited time left, and I've waited ages, so I'd rather not, but I'll talk to you after about it. Sorry, I'm not allowed to say you, my honourable friend. How much time have we got? I'd rather not. Sorry, I've got, because other honourable friends want to get in. But look, there does seem to be, with any mobile phone contract now even, there is a cooling off period, isn't there? And there's a sense of buyer's remorse doing the rounds. I've had emails in a 72% in constituency from people that are saying that they didn't realise it would win. So, I mean, in France, they have a thing where they ban opinion polls in the run-up to it. That's a safeguard we could put in. If we're not saying we're going to rerun exactly the same thing, we could ban opinion polls in the run-up, I think. And nobody knows what Brexit means at all. So, I mean, again, this idea of, it's been mooted by several other members on both sides, having some sort of accountability process. So when in a general election there is a manifesto with codified promises from both sides, maybe in future the lead campaigns on both sides could put, so we've heard that most of these promises were not worth the paper they're written on or the paint that was, I don't know, the cost of the paint on the side of the bus with the lies. So maybe I would advocate that both sides should have proper manifestos from now on, because 48%, voted the wrong way or the right way, whichever you look at it, you can't really call it a ringing endorsement. So maybe if some of those facts were there, because it seems that it's quite possible to do mendacity in these sorts of referenda. So, I mean, from all the government indications, rerunning a referendum that went the wrong way for our side is not an option, but putting in place measures, I would argue for that. And I'd also agree with the honourable member for Brighton Pavilion, who's gone now, that what we could have, I'm just concluding, this is my last sentence, is a referendum on the terms, because nobody knew what it was that they were voting on. So if we had a referendum on what comes the other side of it after these negotiations, I would advocate that. I'm being told to wind up. So, I mean, in short, there is that American saying, the people have spoken, the B star, 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 S's. In some sense, I feel a bit that way. But in short, for the Remainers, we are down, but hopefully not out. Not yet, anyway. Thank you.
Order. I'd be very grateful if the four remaining colleagues took 5 minutes each without interruptions. Mr. Graham Stringer.
I will be as brief as I can, Sir David. I'd never thought of the referendum as a telephone contract before. I thought it was slightly more important than that. In terms of the wording itself, I'm against it, because if you put a threshold on turnout, quite simply it's an incentive for people to stay at home, and it values their abstention like a vote. And if you have a threshold, or if you demand 60% voting one way, then you're saying that some votes are worth more than others. It's a very non-UK tradition. In the 3 or 4 points I want to make, the second point is that the enthusiasm from both sides, both before and after the referendum, has given the lie to what was said in opposition to having a referendum, that nobody cared about Europe. There has been no political debate in this country since I've been in politics that has raised such passion and commitment on both sides, and probably we should have had the referendum a good deal sooner than we did. Thirdly, in terms of the argument to have another referendum, I've looked through the second reading on the 9th of June, and I can't find one reference to any speaker in that debate, including some of the honourable and right honourable members who've spoken today in favour of a second referendum, who were in favour of a second referendum or a referendum on the detail. This is sourness from losers who want a referendum, and it is being wrapped up as, well, all right, we've lost the referendum, we're out, we accept that, we're Democrats, but we'll look at the detail. But if you sit back and think what that means, one, it means complete uncertainty until the details are sorted out and a referendum comes along. And it also means, although different honourable and right honourable members have said that this will not be another in-out referendum, it will be on the details. But if the details are rejected, it either means a third referendum or it means a reversal of the first referendum. So it is, in practice, a referendum, a repeat of the referendum, which might require a third or a fourth referendum, depending how the legislation was worded. So I'm afraid that with all the casuistry that has been used, this is an argument to have the referendum on the same issue again. There is an argument that has been dealt with a little bit, and I strongly approve of the tone of my honourable friend from right honourable friend from Streatham used in this debate. I think we need more of that tone and less of the aggressive tone. But he highlighted, as other members have done, the number of Labour voters, the number of poor and dispossessed people who voted out. There has been some suggestions that these people didn't know what they were doing. In some sense, they were duped. In some sense, they were voting out of anger and dispossession to vote that way. Well, that wasn't my experience. On the day of the referendum, I was out in my constituency in what is either the poorest or the third poorest ward in the country, depending on how you count these things, and I talked to people who were motivated, people who don't normally vote in elections in some cases, people who do vote in elections, some people who vote Labour, some people who didn't vote. And they weren't saying, I'm very angry, I'm very dispossessed. They were voting out of a sense of patriotism and in a sense that they believe that this country should be self-governing democracy. And there is something insulting, particularly from Labour politicians, who say that these people were just voting out of anger and they didn't know what they were doing. They certainly didn't know what they were doing. And when one looks that 70% of Labour constituencies voted to leave the EU, then I think the Labour Party has a great deal of serious thinking to do about how we relate to that, and that is why I appreciated my right honourable friend from Streatham's statement about trying to bring things together. The final point I want to make, I think in the time I've got, is there has been some play in this debate, Sir David, about pledges made during the referendum. Let's be absolutely clear. There were lies told on both sides in this referendum, distortions, call them what you like. And in that sense, it was no different from a general election. Every general election, every local election I've been in, I've thought my opponents were telling lies, and they and could justify it in many occasions. We would rerun every general election if we stopped it because there had been lies told. In actual fact, the nature of debate in this country is to expose those lies, and the strength of our democracy means that they are exposed. But the idea as well that those of us, and I was a member of the Vote Leave Board, that when we debated things and said something, we could commit a Conservative government to doing something. When I was asked during the 50 or 60 debates I did in the run-up to the referendum, what does this mean? I said, what we're actually voting for is the freedom for a United Kingdom government to make decisions. I can't commit that government to doing anything, and neither can anybody else in this campaign. So to say that we have to hold those people who made commitments or statements or arguments during the debate to account is quite simply nonsense in the kind of parliamentary democracy that we live in. So I think we should see the debate for a second referendum as what it is. It is people being angry because they've lost, and hope that will dissipate and we can bring the country together. But it would be a very dangerous, damaging and undemocratic thing to do, to have a second referendum on this issue.
Patrick Grady.
Serve under your chairmanship. I think one of the reasons for the petition having the amount of signatories that it did was because there was some confusion about what Brexit might mean whether what Brexit means Brexit might mean. But I think the consensus has now been established in Westminster Hall very clearly that Brexit does mean breakfast. When I said that before the summer, the BBC thought it was a slip of the tongue, but my honourable friend for Ross and Skye has confirmed that it is in fact the case. Whether it's a dog's breakfast, a full Scottish breakfast, is yet to be determined. But the Prime Minister has appointed some serial Brexiteers to lead the negotiations, so perhaps it's no surprise that some of them are getting a frosty reception in European capitals, and some of our neighbours just want to say cheerio to the UK as soon as possible. I want to reflect very briefly on this petition system and how we got here today in the debate, the issue of thresholds and referendums and the differential result we've had across the UK. 4 million signatures was a remarkable achievement, as was the rapid pace at which it was achieved. And the irony has been noted that the petition was started by a Leave supporter who has since disowned it. These Monday afternoon debates are becoming something of a showpiece, a bit box office. Often this chamber is busier than the main chamber, although not perhaps this afternoon, given the 2 hours that the Brexit Minister was speaking for. We are only too aware, though, that when Parliament debates something is very different from when Parliament decides something. And I think we have to be careful around the petition system that the impression isn't given to constituents. As the Honourable Member for North Antrim suggested, some constituents do get the impression that somehow these debates are going to lead to an immediate change of policy. So I think we all have a responsibility, as do the media, to be clear about what we're trying to achieve in these petition committee debates. And certainly as a member of the procedure committee, I'll be looking at how we can consider that. I think the government, though, should listen to what the procedure committee said about private members' bills, so that we do have, as backbenchers, more opportunity to impose or to bring to the House actual concrete legislative changes. Now, the issue of thresholds, I think, is very important. It has been referred to that there was a threshold in the 1978 Scottish Assembly referendum. If that threshold had been in place in this referendum, then we wouldn't have had a Leave vote. The SNP proposed the four-nation lock, and if that had been in place, if that had been accepted, then the Leave vote would not have stood either. And the SNP, I think, reserve the right to question the result, and particularly question the result as it pertains to Scotland, because we did not vote for the referendum legislation in the first place. We did not see the need for a referendum, and we warned of exactly the kind of situation that we have ended up in. Because I'm quite interested in the champions of participative democracy that we've heard on the government benches this evening, because I understood in this House that Parliament was sovereign and Parliament had the final say. But now it appears they are prepared to concede some of that sovereignty to the people, which we are very happy to accept, because in Scotland we have always accepted the sovereignty of the people. And tomorrow in this chamber we will debate the claim of Right for Scotland, which accepts the right of the people of Scotland to determine the form of government best suited to their own needs. And the reality is the people of Scotland have chosen to remain in the United Kingdom. And so that has to form part now of the UK government's consideration as it takes forward its negotiating position. While there may not be a second referendum on Brexit, there must be an opportunity for Parliament to express its will, its view on the Article 50 process and on the results of the negotiations. And as SNP parliamentarians, we will not vote for any proposal that would take Scotland out of the European Union against its will, and we will resist attempts to bypass Parliament in the process. I understand and I share the frustration of my constituents, over 5,000 of whom signed the petition, the 200, the highest in Scotland outside of Edinburgh, interestingly enough. 78% of my constituents voted to remain, and so, as I say, that has to be taken into account. I hope the government will engage with the Brexit Minister that's been appointed by the Scottish Government. I think that shows the seriousness of the Scottish Government in trying to find a solution that can work within the result that has been delivered. But that doesn't mean we're not, but we, at the end of the day, reserve the right. If there is a material change in circumstances, very interesting to hear the Honourable Member for Streatham use that phrase, if there is a material change in circumstances, we do reserve the right to ask for another referendum, but another referendum on the question of Scottish independence.
Can try to cut out all points that have been made before in the interest of allowing colleagues remaining to speak. Mr Chair, 23,815 people in Bristol West signed this e-petition. I think I was second to the top. Over 80% of my constituents voted in the referendum to remain, and many have told me of their sadness at the result. However, I'm standing to say, and I know it will make some of my constituents unhappy, that I believe it's not right to hold a second referendum. I want to briefly say what their arguments are and then deal with why I'm not going to support that. Some have said that they feel that the campaign for leave was based on misinformation or lack of clear information. I believe that, as others have said, that can also be said for the Remain campaign that I fought as part of. Some have said that there's an argument for a second referendum because the details of the deal were not known or clear at the time of the first, and I have to say I believe my honourable friend from Blakely and Broughton made good points on that topic. Others have said that they would like MPs to scrutinise the detail of the deal, hold government to account, and hold the Prime Minister's feet metaphorically to the fire over every detail, but that they do not want another referendum. That is where my heart lies. And I feel that many of my constituents are going to back me on that, and I'm hoping that most will if they hear my reasons. Some of them have told me themselves that they feel that no matter how sad they are, it's important to respect the democratic process. Many people felt involved in this referendum and were moved to vote for the first time in years. It would be tragic if those people were given the idea that their views were ridden roughshod over and told that they didn't count. However, my constituents have many concerns and want to make sure that there is proper democratic accountability, and I believe this is where the solution lies. We need to act in a way which does not tell voters who voted leave that their views can be dismissed, but also taking into account those who are concerned about what happens next. The Prime Minister has indicated that the government will not put the Brexit settlement to a vote in the House of Commons before Article 50 is in vote. And indeed, I sat through the statement made earlier by the Secretary of State for Brexit, and he did not mention this. Now, in the referendum campaign, Leave campaigners said repeatedly that Parliament should be sovereign. I particularly recall the Honourable Member for North East Somerset making much of this in each of our many vigorous, lively and enjoyable debates. Parliamentary sovereignty is, I believe, now being flouted as the House is being denied the opportunity to debate the Brexit settlement fully and vote on it before Article 50 has been triggered and the clock starts to tick. Once it's triggered, Mr. Chair, then we all know that that will be it. We'll be out in 2 years with or without a good deal. People of all different views on Brexit, whether they voted Leave or Remain in the referendum, will want to know at least some of the details and to know that they're going to be carefully scrutinised and have their views represented in Parliament by their democratically elected members of Parliament, and that they will be given a vote or votes on that settlement. So, Mr. Chair, I believe that many, or perhaps most, of those people who are calling for a second referendum, and I do hope that includes my own constituents, would be satisfied with delegating scrutiny of the detail to their elected member and for us to be trusted to vote against or for invoking Article 50 until we are satisfied that it is a good deal for the UK. And again, I must say, those who voted Leave, I am sure, would also want us to have this scrutiny. Finally, I believe that my constituents want to know that I have been given the chance to defend workers' rights, environmental protection and consumer regulations, to stand up for the EU citizens who have made Bristol their home, to ensure that the world-class university in my constituency has had the opportunity to renegotiate partnerships to carry out vital research, to find ways for Airbus and other big and small local employers to be able to manage their multi-European workforce and the rules and regulations of trade, and to know that I'm going to be able to represent them in a debate and a vote. If the government would be so kind as to agree that Article 50 will not be triggered without the consent first of Parliament until there is a clear plan in place and until there has been full and proper scrutiny of that negotiating plan, if the government would give us this commitment, I believe that this would satisfy most of those who currently ask for a second referendum, including the people of Bristol West, which I represent. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Danielson.
Thanks, Sir David. This has been a curious debate, hasn't it? It's been a bit like the referendum in the sense that there is an issue on the paper and people have largely talked about something else. But that's perhaps partly because of the slightly unfortunate scheduling of this debate whilst there was a major statement in the chamber, which I think was unfortunate. And perhaps some of the points would have been better raised in the main chamber. But the reason I chose to be in here today is because actually the numbers in constituencies like mine and others, perhaps similar cities, are absolutely staggering. 17 to 20,000 people signing the petition. And that comes as no surprise to me because of the strength of feeling. I see the Honourable Member for Peterborough opposite. We're in the same county, but it is a divided county, and there are very different views. And in my city of Cambridge, there's a passion about the European Union and a real sense of loss, genuine sense of loss and worry and concern. So that's why I'm here. What I've taken from the debate so far, though, is that
the 52-48, in a way, the 48 kind of knew what they were voting for. They didn't necessarily all like everything about the European Union, but it was a kind of the status quo. But I think the problem is the 52 were voting for a whole range of different things. And that, I think, is the issue that is before us now, because some people, the people in this room now, who quite clearly want a hard Brexit. They really just want to separate off, get away as quickly as possible, and go into the promised land. But there is a whole spectrum of ways out. And that is the issue which I think is before us, and why this question of whether there should be a further decision is so important. And I'll just give two examples for reasons of brevity. In my city, the issue of people, EU citizens who live and work in the city is a huge issue. I think the council leader told us at a very big rally in the city on Saturday, 9,000 EU citizens living and working around. Now, their status is uncertain at the moment. And we can argue about whether certainty should be given. I strongly feel it should be. But there is uncertainty at the moment. And what is likely to happen as time passes is that people will begin to drift away. It will have an impact on the city. It will be negative. Now, if the deal is to give absolute certainty, that is different from if the deal is uncertain. Let's look at another issue, environmental subjects, which are very dear to many of my constituents. If you look at the nature directives, the birds directives, the clean beaches, we have much stronger legislation from Europe than we do have at the moment from our own Parliament. Now, if that is incorporated into UK law, that would be a different situation from if it is not. People would make a different decision depending upon what happens. So, of course, we can't rerun June the 23rd. The world has moved on. Not only has Britain changed, Europe has changed. It'll be a very different situation in months and years ahead. But surely that is the point of politics. And that is why there will be a further decision at some point in the future. And that's why I passionately believe, whether it's a second referendum or whether it's a general election, there will be a further decision. I'll just finish on this point. There's been passion from the Leave side in this chamber today. Let me tell you, there's passion on the pro-European side, those who believe passionately and are proud of what the European Union has achieved and want to remain in the European Union. And I can assure those who have fought for 20, 30 years with such passion to get us out, there are those of us on this side who will fight just as long to keep us in.
Order. Just to remind the three following the speakers, if we could just leave 30 seconds for Mr. Blackford to respond. Mr. Peter Grant, please.
Thank you, Sir David. It's certainly an interesting debate to attempt to sum up. Clearly I don't have time to cover all of the very interesting points that have been made. Can I apologise first of all to honourable members whose constituencies I'm not familiar with, and if I miss out the right from honourable titles, I'll apologise for that as well. If I don't have time to go round to everybody, you can assume that if they've said something that I agree with, then the point was very well made, and if they've said something I disagree with, then their arguments are fatally flawed and really should not be heard again. I have a huge amount of sympathy with the intention behind the 4 million plus people who've signed this petition. But in my heart of hearts, I can't support the petition the way it's worded, and I can't support the general thrust of the petition, which is we want to have another referendum on membership of the EU, because the most fundamental of my political beliefs is that the people are sovereign. And sovereignty of the people means the people have got the right to be wrong. The people have got the right to take decisions that I personally disagree with. I'm having quite a lot of practice at being gutted and devastated at the results of referendums, at having people who trust me to act on their behalf begging me to force a rerun because there must have been some mistake, and having to say to them, I'm sorry. It's not the way that I wanted it to happen. In both cases, it's not the way that my constituents or my people in Fife had voted, but it is the way that the people as a whole have voted, and we have to respect that. But as part of that, I will demand and I will insist that the people of my country have their wish respected as well. That is a red line as far as I am concerned. I suspect that the frustration that we're seeing from this, and we can't ignore it, I think it's wrong to impugn the integrity and character and honesty of the 4 million people who've asked for a second referendum. I don't impugn the integrity or honesty of the 4 million people who voted UKIP. And I suspect there's not an awful lot of overlap between those two groups of 4 million people. however passionately and fundamentally I might disagree with someone else's view, I will always stand by the right to express it. And I think one of the ills of our politics that we're now seeing come to fruition is that we're far too quick to criticise the integrity and question the motives of people just because they have got strongly differing views from our own. So I welcome the contributions that have been made from all sides, even though some of them I felt were very poorly analysed. Some of them I couldn't possibly agree with. To pick up on one or two of the key points, there was an interesting intervention very early on from the Labour benches, and I'm sorry I can't remember who it was that spoke and whether they're still in the place, suggesting that the demand for a second referendum is damaging to our democracy. No, I think the demand for the second referendum is a very, very strong symptom that our democracy is already severely, if not fatally, damaged. Because the fundamental test of any democratic process should always be that the losers accept that the contest was fair. And in this case, a substantial number of the losers do not believe the contest is fair. And if they're honest about it, a substantial number of the winners probably are not happy at the way that the contest was won. So I don't think we can attempt to rerun that contest. And as some others have said, there may be circumstances in which I would support another referendum to confirm exit from the European Union, but I'm not convinced about that as yet. But I think we've got to stop and ask ourselves, where have the weaknesses been allowed to develop for so long in this so-called mother of all parliaments, that a government can embark on a course that leads to something that the vast majority of the government, including the Prime Minister of the day himself, were convinced would be catastrophic for the nations that they had been elected to serve and to lead. How can we have a position that a government that only got 36% support from those who bothered to turn out and vote can then lead 4 nations of 60+ million people down a path on which the government itself didn't want to embark, where 2 of the 4 equal partner nations were determined not to embark on, and leading us to a position where I honestly can't see any way that England and Wales can retain their membership of the European Union. The best of luck if and when they change their minds and try to get back in. But I can't see an acceptable way that those memberships will be retained. I think it's unacceptable to suggest that Scotland and or Northern Ireland just got to follow suit. I think it's quite interesting. The honourable member for North Antrim said, and I would agree with him, I don't think we can ever say, thank you very much, you've given us your opinion, but I think his quote was, damn you, we're going to ignore you. Well, 57.8% of people in Northern Ireland say we want to stay in the European Union. I'm not prepared to say to those citizens of one of the nations of these islands, well, damn you, we're going to ignore you, we're going to take you out of the EU even if you don't want to go. There's been a lot of discussion about the nature of the wildly untrue statements and promises that were made. And it genuinely scares me that members of Parliament, honourable members of Parliament, can sit here in open forum and say, yeah, but people tell lies in general elections and in council elections. It's just part of the system. It should never be part of the system. I think it is appalling that a member of this Parliament was found in a court of law to have told a blatant lie, and the law does not provide for that person to be forced to seek re-election through a by-election. There's something fundamentally wrong if the political system not only tacitly but now explicitly accepts that telling lies is an accepted part of our political process. And if this whole shambolic affair does nothing more than create a situation where lies and politics and public life are no longer allowed to coexist, then perhaps there will be a bit of a silver lining to this cloud. As I mentioned earlier, I've been through 2 referendums. I'm hoping that the third one I don't lose, or I think if you lose it 3 times you're out altogether. The contrast between the 2 of them could not have been more marked. Others have mentioned the Electoral Reform Society report that highlighted those concerns. Just for one example, on the Sunday after the independence referendum, I, like a lot of campaigners on all sides of the debate, were invited by our local churches to attend services of reconciliation that took place up and down the length and breadth of the country. Yes, no and don't know campaigners and activists literally joining hands in prayer or whatever pastoral prayer for those who don't have a particular faith. The immediate response to the Brexit vote was a substantial and horrific increase in racial violence. If that doesn't tell us that the Brexit referendum has left a legacy far more toxic and far more poisonous than it needed to be, then we're certainly not watching what's really happening in these islands. The legacy that has been left, and I commend the two members who are no longer in their seats for the initiative they took to try to heal the divisions. I don't think those divisions were caused by the referendum. I think the honourable member for Brighton Pavilion referred to the divisions as having been laid bare by the referendum. I think the malaise in our political process has been brought to a focus by that referendum that was always going to happen. The referendum was provoked by the desire of the then Prime Minister to fend off a challenge from the extreme right, not just the extreme right in his own party, but those who were too extreme for his own party, rather than facing down the xenophobes who wanted to demonise immigration, to hold immigrants responsible for all the ills in our society. I think it is sad and shameful that neither of the two major political parties went into the last election saying, you know what, we're not going to be bullied by the keyboard tappers of the Daily Express and the Daily Mail. We're going to tell it like it is, and we're going to say to you, we stand for immigration being a positive contribution to our nations. And if you don't want a government, if you want to vote for a government that says something different, then you can have a government that I'm not part of it. Neither of the two major parties were prepared to do that, because getting re-elected was more important to them than saying what they fundamentally believed in. I cannot believe that the Labour Party produced election material saying vote Labour for strong immigration controls. I was brought up in the Labour Party. The second time I voted in my life, I voted for a Labour MP. The first time, interestingly enough, was the 1979 devolution referendum, and it nearly put me off voting for life when we were cheated out of that one. I can't believe that the party that I was once pleased to support will have any truck with those who want to demonise immigrants and immigration for the ills of society. And when they made that concession, when they started to try to appease the far right, when the government of the day started trying to appease the far right as well, that put us on a headlong course to which Brexit was perhaps inevitable, and the horrific racist and racialistic legacy that has been left in too many of our communities will take a long time to put right. I hope it is put right in time for my friends in other parts of the United Kingdom to be welcomed back into the European Union. But I can tell you something or nothing, Scotland is a member of the European Union now, and I intend for us to stay that way.
Very good. It's always a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. For some, the referendum result represents a moment of golden opportunity. For others, it's a time of enormous economic risk. The petition we're debating today has been signed by an overwhelming number of people who believe that a second referendum should be put to the electorate. It has been signed both by people who voted leave and by people who voted to remain. Curiously, the petition was created in advance of the referendum by somebody who supported the Leave campaign and is said to have believed that the result would be close, but most likely in favour of Remain. He was wrong. With a majority of just over 1.25 million votes, 51.9% of votes cast called for us to leave compared to 48.1% who voted Remain, a turnout of 72.2% of the electorate. Certainly the referendum represented one of the most significant exercises in democracy that we have seen for a very long time. And it was for this reason that the Labour Party tabled dozens of amendments to the EU referendum bill that addressed the concerns raised in this petition, including provisions for electoral turnout and also for securing a minimum threshold. Such amendments were rejected by members in Parliament, alongside provisions that would have allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to have a say in what is the most important decision probably for their generation. But we must be clear. The British people decided in the referendum that our relationship with the EU and its balance of rights and responsibilities was wrong and needed to be addressed. They did not, however, nor could they be expected to, establish what the alternative might be. That is the job that now government and parliament must determine. What makes this process so complex is that we must seek to negotiate our exit from the EU and our future relationship with the EU simultaneously as we forge our future bilateral trade partnerships with other countries. countries who would like to have clarity about where we stand with the EU before they conclude their own trade deal with us. Nothing could have made this more clear than the report released this weekend by the Japanese government. Their proper concern for future access into Europe for Japanese companies who've invested billions of pounds into UK factories, jobs and distribution centres indicates the extraordinary risks that investment in the UK faces if we fail to maintain free movement of goods and services into the world's largest consumer market. The government must also address all of those legislative gaps that will arise as a consequence of our secession from the European Union. The British people did not vote to see their workplaces made more dangerous, nor their maternity rights curtailed. And the government must ensure that where the basis of such rights and protections is lost, the legislation disappearing following a UK exit from the EU, then new primary or secondary legislation is introduced to maintain the standards British people have a right to expect. EU nationals living in the UK and British nationals living elsewhere in the EU are desperate for clarity on where they stand. Does the government plan to remove EU nationals from the UK? Should we prepare ourselves for the repatriation of some 1.1 million British citizens living elsewhere in the EU? These are the non-duckable questions on which government has a duty to provide clarity. I hope the Minister will in his summing up today. EU member states are our closest neighbours and strategic allies in matters of defence and cooperation, and the world is looking to us to set out how we will ensure that our departure does not cause instability throughout the region and consequently further afield. Currently, the EU is the destination for 45% of all the goods and services that Britain exports and the source of 53% of all our imports. This is a stark measure of the level of trade integration that must now be renegotiated in the light of the referendum result. The government must balance, must recalibrate all the different elements that our membership of the EU has previously entailed. Essentially, though, there are three possible trading models. A free trade agreement, in which member countries agree to abolish tariff barriers and quotas for goods and services between themselves. A customs union, in which member countries not only agree to reduce tariff barriers and quotas, but also to adopt common external tariffs towards other countries. Or a single market, in which there is free movement of goods, services, capital and people, labour. In a single market, there's also policy harmonisation over what constitutes such things as fair competition or reasonable health and safety regulations. Although both sides of the referendum campaign lamentably failed to make it clear, in voting to leave the EU, the British people voted to leave both the single market and the customs union. There is no smorgasbord of trade agreements laid out and waiting for the UK to choose from. The options that will be available to us will be determined just as much by what the other EU member states are prepared to give as by what the UK wants. Currently, there is no unified view from the other 27 EU members as to what they are willing to negotiate on. That task is not going to become easier by the forthcoming elections in France and Germany, both of whom could have new leaders by this time next year. Timing in all of this is essential. And those British MPs who say the Prime Minister should simply trigger Article 50 without first setting out to Parliament the terms and basis upon which the government seeks to negotiate, indeed without even indicating the red lines that she would seek to protect, but should do so now, without delay, simply have not grasped the logic of Article 50. It is the logic of the game that young testosterone-fueled car drivers call chicken. The principle of the game is that while it is beneficial for each driver that the other driver gives way, their own optimal choice depends upon what their opponent is doing. If their opponent yields, the driver should not. But if the opponent fails to yield, the driver certainly should give way to avoid a head-on crash. What we know for certain is that no incumbent French or German leader can afford to be seen to be conciliatory towards the UK in negotiations before their election. And yet Article 50 not only triggers those negotiations, it sets a firm time limit within which they must be concluded of 2 years. After that, in default of an agreed negotiated trade settlement, the UK would simply be ejected from the EU with no trade deal at all, unless every country in the EU separately agreed to an extension. This could hold the UK hostage to several very unpalatable ransom demands. Time is critical in negotiating trade deals. Everything must come together because the reality is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Before Article 50 is invoked, the government must set out how they intend to ensure that the promises made to those who vote leave are met. They must decide whether it is vital to keep passporting arrangements for our financial services sector. And if it is a red line, then they must decide what price they're prepared to pay for it. Were that price to be the continuation of free movement of people, many people who voted to leave in the referendum might well feel that the government is simply ignoring their concerns over immigration. Similarly, if a deal were concluded that allowed us to keep single market access and have no free movement of people, our financial contribution towards the EU might have to continue at an extraordinarily high level. A negotiating red line that achieved market access without free movement, but at such budgetary cost, might not be acceptable to those who thought they were voting to stop paying £350 million a week to the EU so they could spend it on the NHS. It might also not appeal to those who voted to leave because they wanted to reclaim the UK's sovereignty. In return for its access to the single market, Norway is obliged to enact 3/4 of all EU laws into its own domestic legislation. A UK under such an arrangement would in effect be a vassal state paying tribute to the EU and meekly enacting the laws passed down by Brussels without the right to influence or shape them that member status confers. Now, none of these arguments are arguments for ignoring the expressed will of the British people, but they are very good reasons for saying that the government must decide precisely what it does want from any negotiation and what it is willing to pay or sacrifice to get it. It is also vital that there is a real democratic oversight. This means that Parliament must be extensively involved in the process, and that once the government is clear what its own objective is, it should then present this to the country. Whilst this petition is evidence that some would wish to see a repeat of the referendum vote, we know that the government have refused this, but at the very least this should be through a parliamentary vote in the House of Commons. Then and only then does it make sense to trigger the UK's departure from the EU by formally invoking Article 50. Article 50 is a fuse. Once it is lit, it cannot be extinguished. If prepared for well, it may lead to an extraordinary firework display as Britain illuminates the world stage with a renewed sense of commercial purpose. If prepared for hastily and badly, that fuse will result in an explosion whose economic consequences will set back our country for a generation.
Minister.
Thank you, Sir David. And I want to congratulate the Petitions Committee for arranging this debate and the Honourable Gentleman for Roscoe and Lochaber for sponsoring it. It's a healthy development that petitions receiving widespread support like this one should be debated in Westminster Hall. And this one has achieved more support than most. We should recognise that. And I recognise the great interest that there is in this subject from around the country. We've heard from many speakers today speaking from constituencies where they had a high turnout. I also think it's striking, as the Honourable Gentleman for Northampton pointed out, that we've not heard from anyone who unequivocally has backed the motion of this petition and called for a second referendum on the same terms. The Honourable Gentleman from the SNP got called short in his statements, but I suspect I'm going to be called rather short in mine as well, so I have some sympathy for him there. However, I would say to him, many of the issues he was raising were addressed in the debate we had on the devolved administrations, and we absolutely stand by the assurances that we gave in terms of engagement with the devolved administrations on those. The Honourable Gentleman for Brent North is an experienced parliamentarian, and he held out all sorts of interesting theoretical possibilities and challenges of the negotiations to come. But in terms of the petition we're dealing with today, he was clear he did not support it. Interestingly, he pointed out that talking about those MPs who were calling for Article 50 to be triggered immediately, of course, one of those was the leader of his party, who on June the 24th
said that Article 50 should be triggered at once, and admittedly in July he did correct himself and recognise it was a good idea to prepare for negotiations. But the referendum, as we've heard, was one of the biggest democratic exercises in British history. Turnout was high, and at 72%, and with over 33 million people having their say. Over 1 million more people voted for Leave than Remain. The turnout was bigger than in any general election vote since 1992, and the second highest popular vote of any form in our long and distinguished democratic history. No single party or Prime Minister has achieved more votes in our history than the vote to Leave in June. And the Honourable Gentleman for Blackley and Broughton spoke with passion about the passion with which the referendum was thought, and the Honourable Lady for Bristol West spoke of people who were voting for the first time in years, and I recognise both of those statements. This was a once-in-a-generation vote, and the decision must be respected. Like many people who signed this petition, though by no means all, I campaigned for a different outcome. But I also spoke out repeatedly in this House, both before and during the legislation for this referendum, to trust the people on this matter. And on June the 24th, I might have preferred a different result, but I didn't falter in my belief. It was right to give the British people their say. And both the Honourable Lady for Ealing and Acton and my honourable friend for Hazel Grove spoke passionately about the stages of grief and people undergoing the stages of grief. One of those is denial, and one thing we cannot do is to deny the outcome of this vote. To deny the outcome or the validity of the referendum is to deny the clear mandate of the British people. And in this House, as other honourable friends have pointed out, we are their servants, not the other way round. There will be no second referendum, no attempts to remain inside the EU, no attempts to rejoin through the back door. Indeed, that would fly in the face of democracy, and I believe entrench the sense of a disconnect between the country and this place that some argue contributed to the referendum result. We must now prepare for the process to exit the EU, as the honourable gentleman opposite has made very clear, and the government is committed to ensuring the best possible outcome for the British people in the negotiations. I cannot cover all the detail of the preparations we're undergoing, but I would refer honourable friends in this chamber and honourable colleagues to the statement made by my colleague, the Right Honourable Gentleman for Halton, Price and Howden, in which he responded for 2 hours earlier today. As he said, we should seek to deliver on what the country asked us to do through the referendum, and we are encouraged by the national move and the fact that many of those who voted Remain now want to make a success of the course that Britain has chosen. We will work very hard to get the best deal we possibly can for the whole of the UK, and the Prime Minister and Conservatives in government will provide strong and proven leadership as the UK begins its negotiations to leave the EU and forge a new world for us, a role for ourselves in the world. As my right honourable friend set out in his detailed statement and in the 2 hours of questions he follows, we will be consulting very widely in that process to make the most of the opportunities that our departure presents, getting out into the world and doing business right across the globe, whilst at home building a Britain that works for everyone. Let me address very precisely the premise of this petition. It called for the referendum to be rerun in the event that certain thresholds or supermajorities were not achieved. Some members have suggested, and other motions have argued, it should be rerun on the basis of the quality of the debate. That is not the subject of this particular petition. And I think honourable colleagues were right to observe that such a criticism could be made of almost any democratic contest in the history of the world, subjectively. The EU referendum bill was introduced in May 2015, following years of long and hard debate. It delivered on a manifesto commitment of my party, which I have little doubt played an important part in our election success. It delivered on the promise given by the government at the last election to give the British people their say on the UK's membership in an in-out referendum by the end of 2017, and then to respect the outcome of their decision. As my right honourable friend for Harpenden pointed out, the last Prime Minister made very clear before the referendum that the government would respect the decision of the referendum. As I'm sure honourable friends will recall, the bill was fully scrutinised and debated in both houses, with this House overwhelmingly supporting it at third reading by a margin of 6-1 before it received royal assent in December 2015. Therefore, I cannot accept the argument that we ought now to have a second referendum, nor can I accept that a threshold ought to have been set when no such provisions were ever put to a vote during the many debates in this House. As my honourable friend for Weston-super-Mare pointed out, and I'm grateful for him bringing his expertise and experience to this debate, these points were never brought up in the debate or put to a vote during that period. And we as parliamentarians signed up to a bill. We must now respect the outcome of the Act and the referendum. It was the Act itself that set the terms of the referendum. It set the question that would appear to the ballot, the absence of a threshold and the franchise. It also provided a power to set the precise date of the referendum in regulations. And just as with the 1975 referendum on Europe and the 2014 referendum on Scottish independence, it did not set a threshold nor require a supermajority for any outcome. The Right Honourable Gentleman for Streatham talked about the 1979 referenda and the fact that they did have, but he also pointed out that the SNP and others opposed them on the grounds and opposed the approach to that in calling for a supermajority. And I recognise as well the point that he was making about bringing people together in the aftermath of the referendum. I think he's right to say that we should bring people together rather than concentrate on rerunning it. He's also right to say that we need certainty, and much of the statement that was set out earlier on today, the announcement from the Chancellor during the summer, is there to provide that certainty moving forward. A second referendum, a third referendum, a never-endum, as other honourable gentlemen have suggested, cannot provide the certainty that our country needs. To conclude, turnout was high, our instructions from British people are clear, and we're moving ahead. The machinery of government is now working hard to get the best deal from Brexit. Respecting the views of the millions who signed this petition, we must also respect the millions who voted on June the 23rd and the clear mandate that was given, not merely from a few weeks of campaigning, but a debate that exercised this House and our nation for decades. I look forward to many more debates in this chamber and then in the House about the nature of our exit and future relations between the United Kingdom and Europe. But I must be clear, on behalf of the government, that we will respect the outcome of this referendum, treat it as an instruction from the British people, and carry out the mandate that they have given us.
Mr. Ian Black. Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I thank all those that signed the petition that got us to this position today that we've had this debate, and can I also thank all the honourable and right honourable members that have contributed to the debate. I was struck by the comment that the Minister has made a couple of times in his contribution, respect the outcome of the referendum. It was also said that the freedom to commit the United Kingdom government in the debate as well. And I don't think many people would disagree with that. I think that would be the fundamentals of our democracy. But I would also ask the Minister once again to recognise that different parts of the United Kingdom voted in different ways. Now, whilst we respect what has happened in England and Wales, I would say to the government that they also have to listen not just to the members of the Scottish National Party, but to the Scottish Parliament that voted so universally to empower the Scottish Government to protect Scotland's position within the EU. And I would really say to the government that they must seek to do that.
Can I read this quickly?